There's a place in my memory that doesn't exist anymore. It's not gone exactly, but it's shifted somehow, like trying to read a word underwater. I can still visit it when I close my eyes, and sometimes late at night I do. It smells like rain on concrete and the dusty warmth of sunlight filtering through old blinds. It tastes like melted popsicles and that weird chalky gum you only got from a gumball machine. And it feels like the first time you ever rode a bike fast enough to scare yourself. The wind pulling at your clothes, the ground blurring beneath your wheels. I was 10, maybe 11, and my best friend and I had a hideout. Every kid dreams of a hideout, right? Ours wasn't much. A forgotten corner of the neighborhood where two fences met in a tangle of overgrown bushes. There was this huge oak tree that must have been older than the houses themselves, with roots that snaked up through the dirt like ancient arthritic hands. We dragged an old tarp out there one afternoon and turned it into a kind of lopsided tent. It sagged in the middle, and the whole thing reeked of mildew. But to us, it was a fortress. We called it the Spot. Not very creative, I know, but back then it felt like naming a country. The Spot was where we planned our escape from boring summer afternoons, strategized for imaginary battles, and swore oaths to each other with sticks we pretended were swords. The rules were simple: no little siblings, no tattling, and no grown-up stuff. We even made a sign out of cardboard that said, "No adults allowed," which, yes, was spelled wrong. Neither of us noticed, and if we had, we wouldn't have cared. One day, we decided we needed treasure. Treasure made sense. It was what every hideout was supposed to have. So, we spent hours digging a hole under the oak tree, even though the roots kept getting in the way. When it was deep enough to bury a shoebox, we filled it with everything we thought was valuable. A plastic dinosaur missing an arm, a glow-in-the-dark bouncy ball, a lucky penny, and a Polaroid picture of the two of us making our best pirate faces. We buried it like it was the Ark of the Covenant and swore we'd never tell anyone where it was. I wonder sometimes if it's still there, waiting for someone to stumble across it. Rainy days had their own kind of magic. My mom always said rainy days were for cleaning, but to me, they were for stories. I'd pile blankets on the floor by the window and sit there for hours, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass. Sometimes I'd read Goosebumps if I was feeling brave, or one of those old books my aunt gave me, the ones with yellowing pages and that musty smell I still associate with treasure maps. Other times, I'd just sit and make up stories in my head, usually about kids who stumbled into magical worlds through wardrobes or old mirrors. I'd picture myself as the main character, of course. It was always me who found the secret key, solved the riddles, and saved the day. And then there were the nights. The quiet ones that seemed to stretch forever, like the whole world had gone to sleep except for me. I had this little tape recorder I'd saved up for with my allowance, and I used to make my own radio shows. I'd talk into the mic like I was a DJ, playing songs off the radio, and adding my own commercials for ridiculous inventions I dreamed up on the spot. My favorite was the Insta Sandwich, which I proudly claimed could make you a peanut butter and jelly just by thinking about it. I'd listen back to those tapes and laugh at myself. Even though I was the only audience I had. I think about those nights a lot, especially now when everything feels so loud all the time. Back then, the dark wasn't something to be afraid of. It was a kind of blanket, soft and protective, wrapping me up in a world where anything was possible. I wonder if anyone else remembers the things I do, like the sound of a rotary phone dialing, or the crackle of a new record dropping onto the turntable, or the specific way the air smelled in the school hallway after lunch. A mix of floor polish and pizza grease that somehow made you feel both grossed out and comforted. I remember sleepovers where the scariest story wasn't from a movie, but from a friend whispering in the dark about her cousin who'd seen a ghost. I remember playing hide and seek in the twilight, holding my breath so hard in my hiding spot I thought my lungs would explode, and then screaming with laughter when I got found. The thing is, those memories aren't just pieces of my past. They're whole worlds frozen in time, and whenever I step into them, they feel so real, I almost expect to see my younger self come running around the corner, hair sticking out in all directions, with some new idea she's convinced is the best one yet. Sometimes I wish I could go back. Not to stay, just to visit. To sit under that oak tree with my best friend and feel like kings of the universe again. to hear the rain pattering on the window while I make up another story about a magical kingdom, to bury another shoebox filled with treasures that seem ridiculous to anyone else but are priceless to me. Do you ever feel that way? Like there's a place in your memory that's waiting for you to visit? What's it like there? Let's start a new story. This morning started like any other. I hit snooze on my alarm 4 times, stumbled out of bed, and immediately tripped over the pile of laundry I swore I'd fold yesterday. As I lay there on the floor, contemplating whether it was socially acceptable to just stay down for a bit, I noticed something odd. There, wedged under my dresser, was a key. Not just any key, though. It looked ancient, the kind you'd see in a pirate's treasure chest or a haunted mansion. It was ridiculously ornate, with swirling patterns carved into the metal and a little gemstone embedded in the handle that glowed faintly. Naturally, I did what anyone would do when faced with a mysterious glowing key. I picked it up. As soon as my fingers touched it, I heard a voice. Not a creepy, "I'm haunting your house" voice, but a casual, matter-of-fact one, like someone commenting on the weather. "Ah, there you are. Took you long enough." I froze, glancing around the room. "Hello," I said, because talking to inanimate objects is apparently my first instinct now. The voice sighed, exasperated. "Yes, hello. Finally. Look, we don't have much time. Insert me into the lock." "What lock? Do I look like I know?" "You're the human. Figure it out." I looked at the key, now more concerned than curious. "You're alive." "Alive is relative," it replied. "But let's not get philosophical. Just find the lock before it's too late." Too late for what? It didn't elaborate, and honestly, I didn't want to know. But there's something about a glowing, sentient key giving you cryptic instructions that makes you curious enough to at least poke around. So, I wandered through my apartment, holding the key out like a divining rod. "Anything? Any vibes?" I asked. The key was silent. I tried the front door. Nothing. The bathroom cabinet. Nope. Even the drawer where I keep my takeout menus, which honestly felt like the most mysterious place in my home. Still nothing. "Are you sure there's a lock?" I asked, frustrated. "It's not a question of sure," the key snapped. "It's a question of belief. You've got to look beyond the ordinary." "Okay, great. Love the riddle, but could you be more specific?" Before the key could sass me again, I noticed something odd in the corner of my living room. It was subtle, like one of those Magic Eye posters you have to stare at forever. A shadow on the wall wasn't quite right. It flickered, almost like it was breathing. I squinted and stepped closer, and sure enough, there was a faint outline of a door. A door that had never been there before. Finally, the key muttered, "Insert me." I hesitated. "What's behind the door? Do you want me to spoil the surprise?" "No, but..." "Then hurry up." So, I took a deep breath and inserted the key into the shadowy outline of the door. The moment I turned it, the wall shimmered like heat waves on asphalt, and a real, solid door appeared. It swung open with a creak, revealing, well, I wasn't sure how to describe it. It was like stepping into a kaleidoscope. Colors twisted and danced around me, forming shapes and landscapes that shifted before I could make sense of them. One second I was standing on a beach where the sand was made of stardust. The next I was in a forest where the trees whispered secrets in a language I couldn't understand. "Where am I?" I asked, stepping forward cautiously. "The in-between," the key said, now glowing brighter. "A place that exists between moments, where things that don't belong anywhere else end up. Keep moving." I didn't need to be told twice. As I walked, the world around me continued to change. At one point, I passed a floating diner staffed by octopus chefs. At another, I crossed a bridge made of clouds, which was trickier than it sounds because the clouds kept shifting under my feet. All the while, the key kept muttering cryptic things like, "We're close," and "No, don't touch that," when I reached for a flower that looked suspiciously like it was made of fire. Eventually, I reached a clearing where a pedestal stood. On it was a lock. It looked like it had been waiting there for centuries, dusty and covered in cobwebs. But as soon as I stepped into the clearing, it began to glow faintly. The key in my hand buzzed with excitement. "There it is," it said. "Insert me, and everything will be set right." Set right? What does that mean? What happens if I don't? Do you really want to find out? I didn't. But I also didn't love the idea of sticking a magical key into an ancient lock without knowing what I was about to unleash. Am I going to regret this? I asked. Almost certainly, the key said cheerfully. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward and inserted the key. The moment it clicked into place, the ground beneath me shook. Light exploded from the lock, shooting up into the sky in a beam so bright I had to shield my eyes. The world around me shifted again, and suddenly I was standing back in my apartment. The key was gone, the door was gone, and everything looked exactly as it had before. For a moment, I thought it had all been some weird dream, but then I noticed a new plant sitting on my windowsill, a tiny sapling with leaves that shimmered like they were made of gold. Attached to it was a note that simply said, "Thanks for the assist. Keep this safe." I have no idea what I unleashed or who I helped, but I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, something is watching and waiting. So, here's my question. If you found a mysterious key that could open a door to anywhere, would you use it? And if so, what would you hope to find on the other side? Let's start a new story. When I first met Nora, I thought she hated me. The signs were all there. The tight-lipped smile when we were introduced, the way she avoided eye contact during meetings, and her habit of sitting at the farthest possible end of the conference table. To be fair, I wasn't exactly going out of my way to win her over. Nora was intimidating in the way that only a supremely competent person can be, the kind of person who writes lists for her lists and has probably never forgotten to send a thank you email in her entire life. Our first interaction didn't help. It was my second day on the job, and I'd already managed to screw up the printer. When Nora walked by, I made the mistake of asking for help. She sighed loudly and pressed 3 buttons, instantly fixing it. Then she said, "Next time, just hold down the reset button for 5 seconds," in a tone that could have frosted a cupcake. I muttered a thank you, and she walked off without another word. From that moment, I mentally labeled her Ice Queen Nora and avoided her like the office plague. And yet, she was impossible to ignore. She had this air about her, like she was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Her desk was immaculate, her emails were flawless, and her PowerPoint slides looked like they'd been designed by a professional marketing firm. Meanwhile, I was over here trying to figure out how to get the stupid coffee machine to stop dripping everywhere. The real turning point came during a fire drill. I'd been stuck in the bathroom when the alarm went off, which meant I had to sprint outside, clutching my phone and a half-eaten granola bar, while everyone else was already lined up in the parking lot. As I joined the group, red-faced and out of breath, I saw Nora standing off to the side with a clipboard. Of course she had a clipboard. When she saw me, she raised an eyebrow and said, "You're supposed to report to your team lead immediately during a drill." I tried to explain, but before I could get the words out, the granola bar fell out of my hand and landed with an embarrassing plop at her feet. For a second, she just stared at it. Then, to my absolute shock, she burst out laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine, can't-catch-your-breath kind of laugh. It was the first time I'd ever seen her lose control, and it was oddly endearing. After that, things started to shift. It was subtle at first. She'd smile at me in the hallway, or leave a sticky note on my desk with a helpful reminder. Once, when I was struggling to assemble a particularly stubborn office chair, she crouched down next to me and said, "The trick is to tighten all the screws halfway first." Her tone was still matter-of-fact, but there was a softness to it now, like she decided I wasn't a complete lost cause. The real breakthrough came during an after-work happy hour. I wasn't planning to go. I was tired, and happy hours with coworkers are always a gamble, but my boss insisted. I was nursing a beer in the corner when Nora appeared beside me, holding a glass of something neon green. "You look like you hate this as much as I do," she said. I laughed nervously. "Not your scene?" "Not really," she admitted. Then, after a pause, she added, "But they have good mozzarella sticks." That was how it started. 2 reluctant happy hour attendees bonding over greasy bar food. By the end of the night, we were swapping stories about our worst bosses, and she was actually smiling. Not the tight-lipped, professional smile I was used to, but a real one, with crinkles at the corners of her eyes. Over the next few weeks, we started talking more. It turned out Nora wasn't cold or aloof. She was just deeply introverted and preferred to observe before jumping into things. Once she let her guard down, she was hilarious in this dry, understated way that I never saw coming. She had a knack for finding humor in the most mundane things, like the ridiculous motivational posters in the break room or the way our office plants seemed to thrive on neglect. One day, she invited me to join her for lunch. I assumed we'd grab sandwiches or something, but she led me to a tiny cafe I'd never noticed before, tucked away behind a row of nondescript office buildings. "Best soup in the city," she said, and she wasn't wrong. Over bowls of lentil soup, she told me about her passion for gardening and how she'd once managed to keep a cactus alive for 12 years, which I didn't even know was possible. It was in that moment, watching her light up over something as simple as soup and plants, that I realized how completely wrong I'd been about her. Nora wasn't an ice queen. She was more like a glacier, cool and unapproachable on the surface, but full of hidden depths once you took the time to explore. The final twist came on a rainy Saturday, months later. I was in my apartment, binge-watching a terrible reality show, when there was a knock at my door. It was Nora, holding a tray of seedlings. "You said you wanted to start a garden," she said, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. We spent the afternoon on my balcony, planting basil and mint and a few flowers I couldn't pronounce. At one point, she looked up from the soil and said, "You know, I didn't think much of you at first." I laughed. "I could say the same about you." She grinned. "Guess we're both terrible judges of character." And that was it. No grand declaration, no dramatic moment. Just two people sitting on a balcony, surrounded by tiny plants and the sound of rain, realizing how far they'd come. So, let's start a new story. It hit me while standing in the self-checkout line at the grocery store. There I was, scanning a carton of eggs, trying not to squish the bread in the bagging area, and staring at a machine that was cheerfully insisting I please remove the last item. The irony was palpable. This robot was bossing me around while I did its job for it. Somewhere in the background, a human employee stood by, ready to swoop in like a referee whenever the machine decided I'd committed some heinous crime, like attempting to scan two bananas as one. It was a perfect snapshot of the absurdity of modern life. Technology hasn't replaced us so much as hired us for unpaid internships. But honestly, that's what makes the world now so fascinating. The lines between what's human and what's machine have blurred in the funniest ways. Like autocorrect, which is technically a feature designed to help us, but in practice, it's that chaotic friend who butts into conversations uninvited. You meant to text your boss, looking forward to the meeting, but instead, autocorrect boldly insists you're looking forward to the meeting. It's like we're all co-writing our lives with an eccentric AI editor who thinks gibberish is good for the soul. And then there's the way we've turned every tiny task into a performance. Remember when cooking was just cooking? You threw some pasta in a pot, maybe added a jar of sauce, and called it a day. Now, every other person has a TikTok account where they film themselves making a 3-layer cake out of ingredients you can't pronounce, using only a spatula and sheer force of will. Meanwhile, I'm still trying to figure out if my oven has a preheat button. It's equal parts inspiring and intimidating. I love the creativity, but sometimes I just want to make toast without feeling like I've let down the ghost of Julia Child. Modern traditions are another marvel. Take unboxing videos. These are people, grown adults, mind you, filming themselves unwrapping stuff. That's it. The whole premise is opening a box. But it's weirdly addictive. I once spent 45 minutes watching someone unpack a deluxe vacuum cleaner, like it was a treasure chest from a pirate movie. They were so thrilled about the extra nozzles, I almost bought one myself, despite the fact that my current vacuum works perfectly fine and hasn't judged me yet. How do we get here? And why does it feel like unboxing videos are the modern equivalent of opening birthday presents in front of your cousins? Even celebrations have taken on this surreal quality. Gender reveals, for example. What started as a simple slice of cake tradition is now a full-blown spectacle involving fireworks, drones, and occasionally a wildfire. There was one video where a guy kicked a soccer ball filled with pink powder, and I swear the crowd cheered louder than they would at the World Cup. It's ridiculous and extravagant and over the top, and somehow deeply endearing. There's something hilarious about how we've decided to announce big news by turning it into a moment. Like, oh, You're having a baby? Cool. But is there a confetti cannon involved? And of course, there's social media, the ultimate stage for our modern lives. What gets me is how we've all become curators of our own museum exhibits. Every Instagram feed is a tiny gallery where we only show the good stuff. Sunsets, brunches, vacations with captions like just a little getaway. Meanwhile, the reality is that you spent half the vacation arguing about parking and wondering why every restaurant required a reservation 3 months in advance. But I love it anyway. There's something strangely beautiful about how we collectively agree to polish the mundane into something worth sharing. Even the way we handle nostalgia has evolved. Remember when we used to print photos and put them in albums? Now we get a notification from our phones saying, "On this day, for years ago," and it shows us a blurry picture of a pizza we once ate. It's like our devices have become little historians, documenting our lives one snack at a time. I got one last week of me holding a cup of coffee, looking absolutely thrilled. I don't remember what made that coffee special, but the picture insists it was an important moment, and honestly, I kind of love that. One of my favorite quirks of modern life, though, is how we've redefined going out. It used to mean leaving the house for something exciting, a movie, a dinner, a party. Now, going out can mean walking to the mailbox in pajamas to retrieve an Amazon package. And it's a moment. You wave at the neighbor, nod like you're doing something productive, and carry your box inside like it's a prize from a game show. Congratulations! You've left the couch and returned with bounty. What's wild is how much we've normalized all this. Like smart home devices. Those little spies we've willingly invited into our houses. They play our music, answer our questions, and sometimes respond to things we never said. My friend once told me her smart speaker started reciting the weather forecast unprompted in the middle of the night, which feels like the first act of a horror movie. But instead of unplugging it, she just said, "How weird," and went back to sleep. That's where we are now. The machines talk back, and we're cool with it. Yet for all the absurdity, there's something undeniably magical about the way we live now. We're connected to each other in ways that would have seemed impossible not long ago. I can text my sister across the country, video call my friend in another time zone, and order a pizza, all in the span of 10 minutes. Sure, the pizza might arrive slightly squished, and my sister might reply with just a thumbs up emoji, but it's still incredible. It's proof that despite all the noise, what we really want is to feel close to each other. So here's the question I keep coming back to. What's your favorite tiny absurdity about modern life? Is it something goofy, like the way we're all obsessed with finding the perfect GIF? Or maybe it's something sweet, like how a random meme can make your day better. I'd love to hear the little things that make you laugh, shake your head, or just stop and think, wow, this is the world we built. Let's start a new story. At least, it felt like it was watching me. I never thought much about the thing before. It was just a plain silver toaster, slightly dented on the side from an unfortunate collision with a jar of peanut butter. But last Thursday, as I stood in the kitchen waiting for my bread to pop up, I realized it wasn't just a toaster. It was a judge, a silent, reflective surface catching my face in the distorted curve of its chrome shell. I looked tired. No worse, I looked guilty. I frowned at my reflection. Why was I even feeling guilty? It wasn't like I'd committed some great breakfast-related crime. But the toaster's warped little mirror showed me otherwise, and I found myself staring into it, trying to pin down exactly what was bothering me. That's when I noticed the dial. The dial on the toaster, which controls how dark or light the toast gets, was turned to 6. 6. That was nearly burnt territory. I hadn't set it to 6. I hadn't set it at all. It was always at 3. A perfect, no-nonsense medium toast. Who had moved it? Otis the cat? Unlikely. He couldn't even open the cupboard without causing an avalanche. My roommate? Emily? Possibly. She'd been on a sourdough kick lately, and she always seemed to overdo it. But she wasn't home. It was just me and the toaster, staring each other down in the pale morning light. Something about the whole situation felt uncomfortably symbolic. The toaster dial, creeping up from 3 to 6. The bread about to be crisped beyond repair. My reflection, bent and strange in the chrome surface. It hit me then, in the way realizations sometimes do, like a slow-moving wave instead of a sudden spark. I was the toast. Or rather, my life was. burn around the edges. Still edible, technically, but not what I'd been aiming for. Somewhere along the way, someone, or maybe just life itself, had nudged my dial up without me noticing. More heat, less care. Work was always spilling into the evenings. Friends felt like a series of missed calls. Hobbies were gathering dust in a closet I hadn't opened in months. And here I was, waiting for toast to pop up like it was just another task to tick off a list. I reached out and turned the dial back down to 3. When the toast finally popped up, it was darker than I liked, but still salvageable. I spread some butter over it, real butter. Not the weird low-fat spread I'd been using out of some misplaced sense of responsibility, and sat at the table to eat. For the first time in what felt like weeks, I actually tasted it. The warmth, the crunch, the faint, nutty sweetness of the bread underneath. The toaster, I realized, hadn't been judging me at all. It wasn't even capable of judgment. It was just a toaster doing its toaster thing. The judgment had come from me, reflected back through that shiny, curved surface. Later that day, I called Emily to ask if she'd messed with the dial. She laughed and said, "You think I'm a 6 toast kind of person? Please. I'm a solid 2. It didn't matter really. What mattered was that a toaster, a plain, slightly dented, chrome toaster, had forced me to confront my own burnt edges. That night, I dug out my old sketch pad from the closet and spent an hour doodling while Otis batted at the pencils. I don't know if there's a moral to this story, except maybe this. Sometimes the universe gives you a wake-up call in the least glamorous way possible. No epic epiphanies, no sweeping cinematic moments. Just a toaster and a dial, and the quiet realization that you're the one in control of the heat. So now I have to ask, have you ever had a moment like that? Something small and stupid that managed to flip your perspective entirely? If you've ever been humbled by a household appliance, or anything else equally ridiculous, I'd love to hear about it. Maybe we're all just toasters in disguise, waiting for someone to notice the dial. Let's start a new story. It was the laundromat of all places where it happened. You'd think the universe would choose somewhere grander to deliver a revelation, a mountaintop, a cathedral, maybe even a scenic overlook. But no, my life-altering moment arrived between a broken dryer and a vending machine that only sold stale Pop-Tarts. It was one of those sticky summer evenings when the heat clings to your skin like bad decisions. I had a basket full of clothes, mostly damp towels and the one pair of jeans that still fit right, and a head full of useless regrets. My laundry card was out of money, and the change machine was out of quarters, because of course it was. I was about to leave in a huff when I noticed the door chime. In walked a man carrying a single item, a red hoodie. It was the kind of hoodie that looked soft enough to nap in and frayed, just enough to suggest it had been through things. Rainstorms, breakups, maybe even a spontaneous road trip or two. The man looked equally weathered, but not in a bad way. His face had a kind of calm that suggested he either knew a lot or cared very little, and I couldn't decide which one it was. He didn't seem to notice me. He just walked straight to the washer nearest the window, tossed the hoodie in, and started the cycle. No detergent. No curters. No nothing. Just water and motion. Forgot your soap, I said, because the combination of heat and boredom made me braver than usual. He turned to me, and his expression was almost amused, like he'd been expecting me to comment. Don't need it, he said, his voice low and steady, like the kind of voice that could calm a barking dog or convince you to buy a useless warranty. I laughed awkwardly. What? You believe in the power of positive thinking or something? He didn't laugh back. Instead, he reached in his pocket and pulled out a coin. It wasn't a regular quarter. It was heavier, shinier, etched with symbols I couldn't place. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger. Ever hear the phrase, cleanliness is next to godliness? Sure, I said, leaning on my basket, but I'm pretty sure that still involves soap. Soap's just chemistry, he replied. This is geometry. He slid the coin into the pocket of his jeans, turned back to the washer, and left it at that. For the next 30 minutes, I tried not to stare as he sat by the window, completely still, watching the hoodie spin like it held the meaning of life. Every now and then, he would glance at the vending machine, frown slightly, and look back at the washer. Meanwhile, I fought with a dryer that refused to stay balanced. my curiosity growing with every uneven thud. When the washer beeped, he stood, pulled the hoodie out, and held it up to the light. It looked perfect, not just clean, but pristine like it had been reborn. No stains, no fraying, not even a wrinkle. The thing practically glowed. I couldn't help myself. "All right, what's the deal with the coin?" He smiled then, a small, knowing smile that made me feel like I'd just asked the right question on a game show. "It's not about the coin," he said. "It's about the act. You see, most people think cleaning is about removing something, dirt, grime, the smell of regret. But it's really about restoring what's already there. The coin just reminds me how to focus." I stared at him, my towel half hanging out of the dryer. That's either the deepest thing I've ever heard or complete nonsense. "Why not both?" he said, tucking the hoodie under his arm. Then, as casually as if he were offering me a stick of gum, he added, "You should try it sometime." "Try what?" He gestured to the broken vending machine. "Focus. Start small. Fix what's out of balance." I glanced at the machine. The red light on the front blinked mockingly out of service, as if it had been taunting laundromat customers since the dawn of time. "It's broken," I said. He shrugged. "Doesn't mean it can't be fixed." Then he walked out, leaving behind the faint smell of rain and something unplaceable, like pine needles and fresh paint. I don't know what possessed me, but I walked up to the vending machine and stared at it. Up close, it looked even more pathetic. Rust around the edges, a sticker peeling off the glass, buttons so worn the numbers were barely visible. But the man's words echoed in my head. "Fix what's out of balance." I pressed a few buttons, jiggled the coin return, and gave it a light kick. Nothing. I was about to give up when I noticed a small panel on the side, loose enough to pry open. Inside was a jumble of wires, one of which had clearly come undone. I reconnected it with my car keys, closed the panel, and stepped back. The machine blinked. Then it hummed. Then it worked. I pressed a button on impulse, E5, and out dropped a single, perfectly wrapped Pop-Tart. I laughed, startled by how proud I felt over something so small. But in that moment, it wasn't about the Pop-Tart. It was about restoration, the act, the focus. That night, I went home and found the red hoodie man's coin in the pocket of my jeans. I still don't know how it got there, or how the vending machine started at all, but every time I see it sitting on my dresser, I remember his words. So, do you ever find yourself staring at something broken, something small, something no one else would bother with, and feel like fixing it might fix you too? Let's start a new story. It began with a crack in the sidewalk, though I didn't know it at the time. Just a jagged line in the concrete, spidering outward from the base of an old elm tree on the corner of Jefferson and 6th. I'd walked past it 100 times without noticing. But on that particular Tuesday, as I was trudging home from yet another long day at work, something made me stop. The crack wasn't just a crack anymore. It had grown, or maybe it had always been that big, and I never looked closely. What caught my eye wasn't the size, though. It was the glint of something metallic, wedged deep in the crevice. Without thinking, I crouched down and dug my fingers into the cool dirt, pulling it free. It was a tiny tin box, no bigger than a deck of cards, its edges dented and rusted with time. There was no writing on it, no design, just the faint imprint of a flower, almost worn smooth. It felt warm in my hand, though the evening air was chilly, and for some reason, it made my heart race. I should have left it there. That's the kind of thing people always say in stories like this. I should have walked away. But of course I didn't. Instead, I slipped it into my coat pocket and carried it home, where it sat on my kitchen table for hours, daring me to open it. When I finally did, it wasn't dramatic. No fanfare, no mystical glow, just the soft, reluctant pop of a lid that hadn't been opened in years. Inside, there was a small slip of paper, folded so precisely it looked like origami. I unfolded it carefully, half expecting it to crumble to dust. Instead, I found a single line written in a hand so neat it could have been printed. "Where do you want to go?" That was it. No explanación, no signature. Just a question. I stared at it for what felt like forever, trying to make sense of it. I even laughed out loud, thinking it must be some kind of joke. But then something happened that I still can't explain. The air around me shifted, growing heavier and still. The light in the room dimmed, not like a bulb flickering, but as if the sun itself had taken a step back. And then the box, the empty, harmless little box, seemed to hum. Not loudly, but just enough to make the hair on my arms stand up. It was waiting. Without really thinking, I whispered, "Home." The moment the word left my lips, the room tilted. Not literally, but the feeling was the same, like when an elevator drops too quickly. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself, but the sensation passed as quickly as it had come. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my kitchen anymore. I was standing in the backyard of the house I grew up in, surrounded by the lush, overgrown garden my dad used to spend hours tending. The evening air was warm and thick with the smell of honeysuckle, and the cicadas were singing in that endless, lazy rhythm I'd forgotten. For a moment, I just stood there, dumbfounded. It wasn't a memory, and it wasn't a dream. It was real. Then I heard my name. I turned and saw her. My mom, younger than I remembered, standing on the porch with a dish towel slung over her shoulder. She smiled at me, and my heart cracked wide open. I wanted to run to her, to tell her everything, but I couldn't move. I could only stand there, rooted to the spot. As she called out, "Dinner's ready." And just like that, I was back in my kitchen. The slip of paper was still in my hand, the box sitting innocently on the table. My heart was racing. My palms were slick with sweat. But all I could think was I had to do it again. The second time I asked for something more specific. That summer at the lake, I said, my voice trembling. The hum returned, and once again, the world shifted. This time, I was standing on the dock, the sun setting over the water in a blaze of gold and orange. My cousins were cannonballing off the edge, their laughter ringing out across the still lake. I could smell the charcoal from the grill, hear the crackle of the fire pit we'd build later, taste the sticky sweetness of esmores on my tongue. It was perfect, too perfect. And then I noticed the ripples. They started small, barely visible, spreading out from the center of the lake. At first, I thought it was a fish, but as the ripples grew wider and closer, I realized they weren't coming from beneath the water. They were coming from me. My presence wasn't just an intrusion. It was a distortion, bending the edges of the moment like glass under pressure. I barely had time to register what was happening before I was yanked back into my kitchen, the box trembling violently on the table. I shoved it away, my hands shaking. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a window into the past. It was changing something, and I didn't want to find out what. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. Over the next few weeks, I tried to stay away. I buried the box in the back of a drawer, told myself it wasn't worth the risk. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the possibilities. The conversations I could have, the things I could fix, the people I could see just one more time. Eventually, I gave in. The last time I used it, I was more careful. I chose something small, something safe. The night we caught fireflies. The box hummed, the light dimmed, and the air shifted. But instead of the backyard from my childhood, I found myself standing in a void. It wasn't dark or light. It was nothing. Empty, silent, infinite. And in the center of it was a single jar, glowing softly. Inside, a firefly flickered. A voice I didn't recognize whispered, "This is all that's left." When I reached for the jar, the void collapsed, and I was back in my kitchen. The box was gone. So was the slip of paper. I haven't seen it since, but sometimes I catch a whiff of honeysuckle or hear the faint buzz of cicadas, and I wonder, did I bring a piece of those moments back with me? Or did I leave a piece of myself behind? If you found a key to your past, how far would you go before you lost yourself in it? Let's start a new story. Okay, so there's this thing I do when I have a crush. I didn't realize it was weird until I casually mentioned it to a friend, and she said, "That's not normal." I'll admit it. When I'm into someone, I secretly start keeping a catalog of the things they might lose. Stay with me. It's not like I break into their house or anything. It's more subtle than that. If they're holding a pair of sunglasses, for example, my brain will quietly take a mental snapshot and think you're going to lose those, and when you do, I'll be ready to help. Or if they're always fumbling with a favorite pen, my brain whispers, that pen is doomed. But don't worry, I've already found its replacement on Amazon. It's not about stalking or rescuing people, I swear. It's just this compulsive kindness. I think it started in middle school. I had this massive crush on a boy named David, who was perpetually losing his homework, his water bottle, his entire backpack one time. It got to the point where I started carrying an extra pencil around just for him, because he'd always forget his during math class. I never said, "This is for you," or made a big deal about it. I just casually offer it like, "Oh, you can borrow mine." I liked the idea that I could quietly make his day a little better without him even realizing I planned it. Apparently, I never grew out of it. These days, I don't carry extra pencils, but my brain still keeps a running inventory of potential losses. Take this guy I've been crushing on recently. Let's call him Eric. He's the kind of person who always has a frayed phone charger in his bag and a pair of headphones with one earbud that works if you wiggle it just right. He has these big, clunky keychains that make him look like a janitor, but somehow he still manages to lose his actual keys every couple of days. The first time we hung out, he couldn't find his wallet, and I joked, "If I were your roommate, I'd Velcro everything you own to the walls." He laughed, and for a second, I thought, okay, maybe I can help you with this. That's when the cataloging started. Over the next few weeks, every time I saw him, I'd make these quiet little notes. His favorite mug? It had a tiny chip in it. I decided I'd find him another one, something equally ridiculous with a handle that wouldn't break off. His jacket? He left it at my friend's place once, so I added better coat system to my mental list. And don't even get me started on his dog's leash, which was held together with duct tape. Every time I saw it, I thought, one day you're going to drop that leash, and this dog is going to disappear into the horizon like a furry comet. I guess it's my way of caring. Some people flirt by complimenting your smile or making witty jokes. I silently prepare for the day your sunglasses fall off your head and into a sewer grate, because I want to be the person who magically has another pair in my bag. But here's the kicker. I've never actually used my weird little catalog. I never hand over the replacement mug or casually slip someone a new pen. I just hold on to this mental archive of what they might need, as if I'm preparing for a rescue mission that'll never come. It's not about being a hero. It's more about knowing them, noticing the little gaps in their life, and quietly filling them in my mind, like painting over a canvas nobody else sees. I'm not sure if it's sweet or creepy. Maybe it's both. But last weekend, something weird happened. Eric came over to my place to help me set up this secondhand bookshelf I'd been meaning to assemble for weeks. We were halfway through tightening the screws when he said, "Oh, by the way, thanks for letting me borrow your umbrella the other day. I forgot to bring it back." I froze. I didn't lend him an umbrella. I stared at him, confused, until he pointed to the corner of my apartment, where this big, bright green umbrella was leaning against the wall. "It wasn't mine. I thought you left it here for me," he said, grinning. "You're like my little inventory fairy or something. Always one step ahead." I didn't tell him I'd never seen that umbrella in my life. Instead, I laughed and said, "Yeah, I'm good like that." And for a second, I wondered if maybe he had been cataloging me too, seeing the gaps I didn't even know I had and quietly filling them. It's funny, isn't it? How love, or the beginnings of it, makes us notice things we'd usually miss. Not just the grand, obvious parts of someone, but the tiny fractures they carry, the invisible losses they don't even know are coming. And maybe that's the whole point of caring about someone. Not fixing them, but being the person who shows up when something slips through the cracks. So, now I'm curious. Do you have a secret way of showing someone you care? A quiet little quirk you've never shared with anyone? Or am I the only one here living with a catalog full of imaginary rescue plans? Let's start a new story. The package arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier who looked as bored with life as I felt. It was addressed to me, but I hadn't ordered anything. The label was blank aside from my name and address, and the box itself was plain brown, taped neatly, no logos or markings to give away its origins. I wasn't expecting a bomb or anything. I'm not exactly the kind of person who inspires vendettas, but the mystery of it was enough to make me hesitate. I set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a while like it might explain itself if I gave it time. It didn't. Eventually, curiosity won out. I grabbed a knife, slit the tape, and opened it. Inside was a single Polaroid photo. It showed a woman sitting in a diner booth, smiling faintly at the camera. She had dark, wavy hair, the kind that always looks perfect even when it's messy, and wore a red leather jacket that practically glowed against the bland linoleum backdrop. Something about her seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. Beneath the photo was a note, scribbled on a torn piece of paper. Find her. She knows. That's it. No name, no signature, no context. Just those cryptic words. I flipped the photo over, hoping for more clues, but the back was blank. I checked the box again. Empty. No return address. No hidden compartments. Just a Polaroid and a vague command. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The woman's face lingered in my mind, like a song you can't quite remember the lyrics to. Who was she? And what was she supposed to know? The logical thing would have been to ignore it. Toss the photo, recycle the box, move on with my life. But logic had never been my strong suit. So, that night, I found myself at the local diner, sitting in a booth that looked eerily similar to the one in the photo. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. A sign, maybe, or some kind of cosmic coincidence that would make everything click into place. Instead, I found the waitress, a wiry woman with a sharp smile, eyeing me like I was casing the joint. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, plopping a coffee cup onto my table without asking if I wanted one. "I live across town," I said. She lingered, wiping the table next to mine even though it was spotless. "What brings you here?" I hesitated, then decided to show her the photo. "Do you recognize her?" She glanced at it, and for a split second, her face changed, just a flicker, barely noticeable, but enough to tell me she knew something. "Nope," she said too quickly. "Sorry." She walked away before I could press her, disappearing into the kitchen. That was the first sign something was off. The second came a few minutes later when I noticed the man in the corner booth. He was pretending to read a newspaper, but his eyes kept darting to me over the rim of his glasses. He had the look of someone who didn't quite belong, his suit too crisp, his posture too stiff. When I got up to leave, so did he. I took a roundabout route home, weaving through side streets and alleys, trying to shake the feeling of being followed. By the time I reached my apartment, I was sure I'd lost him. But when I unlocked my door, there was another package waiting on the kitchen table. Same plain box, same blank label. My heart pounded as I opened it, half expecting something gruesome or threatening. Instead, there was another Polaroid. This one showed the same woman, but now she was standing outside a gas station, her expression tense, as if she were arguing with someone just out of frame. The same note was tucked beneath it. Find her. She knows. That's when the knock came. I froze. It was loud and deliberate, the kind of knock that doesn't ask, it demands. "Open the door," a voice called. Deep, calm, and utterly unfamiliar. I didn't move. "We know you've been looking. Open the door, and we can help." Help? The kind of help that knocks like a debt collector in the middle of the night? I don't think so. Grabbing the photo, I backed toward the window, sliding it open as quietly as I could. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of a lock being picked. I didn't wait to see who was behind the door. I dropped onto the fire escape and ran. The next few days were a blur of cheap motels, burner phones, and sleepless nights. Everywhere I went, it felt like someone was watching, a stranger on the subway, a car parked too long outside my window. And always, the woman in the photo haunted me. Her face, both a mystery and a warning. I never found her, but sometimes when I'm sitting alone in a diner or passing by a gas station at night, I catch a glimpse of red leather in the corner of my eye. And I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for me to find her, or if she's the one doing the finding. Let's start a new story. The day had been relentlessly ordinary. Emails, a lunch of leftovers, a few errands in town. By mid-afternoon, the sun was sinking low enough to cast the kind of gold that makes everything look more interesting than it really is. I found myself wandering, bag of groceries in hand, past a stretch of old storefronts that had clearly seen better days. I wasn't in any particular hurry, so when a flash of bright red caught my eye in a dusty window display, I stopped. It was a small, weathered shop, the kind of place that looks like it might sell antiques or taxidermy, or both. Above the door, there was a faded wooden sign that read, "Yesterday's Things," painted in letters so uneven they could have been done by a child or someone who just didn't care. Through the window, I saw a jumble of objects, glass bottles, chipped figurines, a rotary phone, and nestled in the chaos was the thing that had stopped me, a red Viewmaster. Do you remember those? A clunky plastic contraption with a lever on the side that clicked through a reel of 3D slides. I hadn't seen one in decades, but seeing it now, my brain fizzed with a strange, nostalgic excitement. I pushed the door open, and the bell above it let out a metallic chime, as if startled by use. The shop smelled like old wood and something faintly medicinal, maybe mothballs. The shelves were packed with a hoarder's logic. Piles of faded magazines, tarnished spoons, and toys that looked like they belonged in a museum for broken childhoods. And there it was, sitting on a stack of books. The red Viewmaster, its plastic edges scuffed, but intact. I picked it up carefully, half expecting it to disintegrate in my hands. It felt lighter than I remembered, like holding the ghost of something solid. A little tin box sat next to it, the kind you'd use to store sugar cookies, but judging by the faded label taped to the lid, it was stuffed with reels. A voice behind me said, "Still works." I turned to see the shopkeeper, a woman in her 60s, wearing an oversized cardigan and an expression that suggested she knew exactly why I'd come in. She had one of those faces that seemed permanently on the edge of a knowing smile, like she was in on a secret you weren't ready to hear. "Go ahead," she said, nodding at the Viewmaster. I slid one of the reels into the slot. It clicked into place with the satisfying sound of something designed before planned obsolescence. Lifting it to my eyes, I pressed the lever. The first image appeared, crisp and vivid, a snowy mountain scene, like something from a calendar. I clicked again, a waterfall, sunlight dancing through the spray. It was all impossibly clear, like I could reach out and touch it. I was ready to click again when the third slide appeared, and everything stopped. It wasn't a landscape this time. It was a room. My room. Not the room I lived in now, but the room I'd grown up in. The pale blue walls, the creaky old desk with the stickers peeling off one leg, the mismatched curtains my mom had sewn from leftover fabric. It was all there, frozen in perfect detail, right down to the crooked picture frame I'd hung above my bed. I lowered the Viewmaster and blinked, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. I glanced at the shopkeeper, but she was busy dusting a shelf, utterly uninterested in my existential crisis. I looked through it again. The room was still there, exactly as I remembered. I clicked the lever. Another slide, my old backyard. The swing set, the lilac bushes along the fence, even the patch of bare dirt where nothing ever seemed to grow. My breath caught. This wasn't possible. These weren't generic scenes from a manufactured reel. They were mine. I clicked again. This time, it was the kitchen, bathed in golden afternoon light. My mom was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot. My dad was at the table, squinting at the sports section of the newspaper, his glasses sliding down his nose. I felt an ache rise in my chest so sharp it bordered on pain. I don't know how long I stood there, clicking through those slides, each one pulling me deeper into a past I hadn't realized I'd buried. My 8th birthday party, with the lopsided cake my mom made and my friends crowding around the table. A trip to the beach, my dad laughing as he held up a sand dollar he'd found. Even the time my hamster escaped, and I found him hiding in a pile of laundry. There it was, immortalized in one tiny, impossibly detailed slide. By the time I reached the last image, I was trembling. It was my younger self sitting cross-legged on the floor of my old room, staring at something just out of frame. I looked so small, so unguarded, like I hadn't yet learned how complicated the world could be. I lowered the Viewmaster slowly, the weight of all those memories pressing down on me. "How did you get these?" I asked the shopkeeper, my voice barely above a whisper. She shrugged, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "They find their way to me. People only see what they're meant to see." I wanted to ask what that meant, but something about her expression told me I wouldn't get a straight answer. Instead, I handed her the cash for the Viewmaster and the tin of reels. She slid the money into an ancient cash register without comment, and I left the shop, clutching the Viewmaster like it was a fragile piece of treasure. At home, I set it on my desk and stared at it for a long time. I haven't looked at the slides again. Not yet. Maybe I'm afraid they won't be the same, or maybe I'm afraid they will. But every now and then, When the world feels too loud or too heavy, I'll glance at it and feel the tiniest glimmer of something I thought I'd lost forever. Have you ever stumbled across something so ordinary, so unexpected, that it cracked your world open and showed you a piece of yourself you'd forgotten? Let's start a new story. It began, as so many strange moments do, with a sound. A faint clink of glass on glass. I almost missed it, caught up in my thoughts as I walked through the city on autopilot. But there it was again, sharp, deliberate. I turned my head and saw a man standing behind the window of a corner shop, arranging jars of honey into a precarious pyramid. He worked slowly, carefully, his hands hovering like a magician's over each jar before he set it into place. Golden light from the jars spilled onto the pavement outside, pooling at the feet of the passers-by who didn't notice. I stopped transfixed. There was something reverent about the way he worked, as though this task, stacking honey, was a sacred act. A woman brushing past me muttered something about people stopping in the middle of the sidewalk, and I shook myself back into motion. But for the rest of the day, the image of that glowing pyramid followed me, a faint thread of warmth tugging at the edges of my thoughts. Further down the street, a man on a ladder was stringing holiday lights between two lampposts, his silhouette dark against the overcast sky. The bulbs were still unlit, but as he climbed down to inspect his work, he smiled, as if he could already see the glow they'd cast over the street that evening. Below him, a kid on a skateboard kicked off and zoomed past, his backpack flapping like wings. At a cafe, I saw an older couple sitting by the window. The man had his hands wrapped around a steaming mug, while the woman was leaning forward, laughing at something he'd said. He wasn't laughing with her. His face was still and serious, but there was a softness to his expression that made me wonder if he was secretly proud to have made her laugh. She reached across the table and tapped his hand lightly with her fingertips, a gesture so brief it might have been missed entirely. But he noticed. I could tell by the way his shoulders relaxed, the way he brought the mug to his lips like it was a shield for the quiet grin he didn't want her to see. A block later, I passed a musician sitting on the steps of a library, a battered guitar balanced on his knee. He wasn't playing it, not yet. He just sat there, tuning the strings with an almost meditative focus. The crowd moved around him, the steps swallowing and spitting out people at a steady rhythm. But he might as well have been alone in a forest. As I walked by, I realized he was humming to himself, the melody soft and searching, as if he were trying to coax something out of the air. The air itself carried its own weight of stories. The faint, metallic clang of a streetcar rounding a bend. The rhythmic beep of a crosswalk signal. A snippet of conversation. But if you look at it that way, you're missing the point. The words stayed with me, dislodged from their context, like the fragment of a poem. I turned onto a quieter street, where the buildings leaned in closer, their windows like rows of watchful eyes. A cat perched on a fire escape, licking one paw with lazy precision. Below it, a pair of shoes dangled from the power line, swinging slightly in the breeze. I'd passed this street dozens of times, but somehow I'd never noticed those shoes before. They looked impossibly fragile up there, their laces fraying like spider silk, and I wondered how long they'd been suspended in that strange limbo. Outside a corner bodega, a man was stacking crates of oranges. He worked quickly, tossing each orange in a place like he'd done it 1,000 times. A little girl holding her father's hand tugged him toward the display, her eyes wide with wonder. She reached out, but the man shook his head and pointed to the sign, "Please don't touch the fruit." Her father knelt and whispered something in her ear, and she nodded solemnly. Then, without warning, the man plucked an orange from the top of the stack and handed it to her. Her face lit up like the world had just opened itself to her in a new way, and she clutched the orange to her chest as though it might escape. I kept walking, the memory of her smile trailing behind me like sunlight. At the edge of the park, I stopped to watch a group of kids playing soccer on the damp grass. They were all barefoot, their sneakers and socks piled in a careless heap on the sidelines. The ball was deflated, more oval than round, but that didn't seem to matter. Every kick, every wild lunge after the ball was accompanied by laughter so loud and full it drowned out the noise of the city. Nearby, An old man sat on a bench, carving something into a piece of wood. I couldn't see what it was, but the shavings curled at his feet like tiny question marks. As I turned to leave, a crow swooped down and landed on a trash can, its beady eyes scanning the ground for scraps. It found a crumpled napkin, held it in its beak for a moment, then dropped it and flew away. I don't know why, but the sight of that napkin felt oddly significant, as though it were part of a message I wasn't clever enough to decode. By the time I reached my apartment, the light had begun to change, softening into that golden haze that makes everything look a little more beautiful than it actually is. I paused outside my door and looked back at the street, at the people moving through it like threads weaving an invisible tapestry. None of them knew I was watching, and I knew they wouldn't remember this moment. But I would. So tell me, what's the last thing you noticed that made the world feel just a little bit larger than it did the moment before? Let's start a new story. It's amazing how your life can unravel over something as innocent as a jar of pickles. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean an actual glass jar, the kind that laughs in your face when you try to twist the lid off. If you've ever stared down a stubborn jar, you already know the stakes. It's not about the pickles, it's about pride. Unfortunately, pride is a cruel opponent. This story begins with me in my kitchen counter, attempting to open a jar of dill pickles I'd bought for a sandwich. I tried the usual tricks, gripping it with a towel, running it under hot water, smacking the lid with a spoon like a passive-aggressive woodpecker. Nothing. The jar remained unyielding, mocking me with its vacuum-sealed arrogance. And then I made a decision that would haunt me. I went to my upstairs neighbor for help. To understand why this was a mistake, you need to know about Ron. Ron is in his late 60s, retired, and built like a lumberjack who moonlights as a competitive weightlifter. He has one of those gravelly voices that makes every sentence sound like the start of a legend. Ron and I have exchanged pleasantries in the hall, mostly him asking why I keep forgetting to pick up my packages, but I wouldn't say we were close. Still desperate times. When Ron opened the door, he was holding a coffee mug that said "World's Greatest Grandpa," even though I'm pretty sure he doesn't have kids. "What's up?" he asked, peering at me over his glasses. "Hey Ron, weird question, but can you open this for me?" I held out the jar, trying to look casual, like this was a totally normal interaction and not the beginning of my personal descent into madness. He took the jar, frowned at it, and then gave me a look that said, "You couldn't handle this yourself?" Without a word, he gripped the lid and twisted. It didn't budge. He tried again, his biceps flexing like the opening scene of an action movie. Nothing. "Well, this thing's a son of a gun," he muttered, setting his coffee down. He grabbed a rubber grip pad from his counter, because of course Ron has a designated jar opening tool, and tried again. The lid stayed firmly in place, as though glued on by spite. At this point, the jar wasn't just a challenge. It was a villain, a worthy adversary. And Ron, bless his pride, wasn't about to lose. "I'll get it," he said. "Wait here." He disappeared into his apartment, and I could hear the clinking of tools. Tools! When he returned, he was carrying a wrench. A wrench! "This ought to do it," he said, looking at the jar like it had personally insulted him. It didn't do it. Neither did the hammer he brought out next. Neither did the trick where you stab the lid with a knife to release the vacuum seal. Although that did result in a spectacular geyser of pickle brine that splashed Ron in the face. He wiped it off with his sleeve like a war hero shrugging off shrapnel. "You got a towel?" he asked. I nodded, dumbstruck. "Ron, maybe we should." "Quiet," he said, holding up a hand. "This isn't over." Word must have gotten out, because by the time we hit the 10-minute mark, Mrs. Alvarez from down the hall had joined us, holding her own jar of olives, presumably in solidarity. Then Greg from 3B wandered in, drawn by the noise, carrying a jar of peanut butter, just in case Ron was handing out miracles that day. Soon, we had an impromptu jar opening support group in my tiny apartment. Ideas were thrown around like we were planning a heist. "Boil it," someone shouted. "Try the freezer," yelled another. Greg offered to call his cousin, who was good with physics. It was chaos, but the kind that bonds people. By the end of it, we were all laughing. Even Ron, who finally conceded defeat and said, "This jar's cursed. Throw it in the river." We never got the lid off. Not that night, anyway. The jar sits on my kitchen shelf now, unopened, like a trophy or a warning. I bought a new jar the next day, but I can't bring myself to toss the original. Every time I see it, I think about that weird, wonderful night when half my building came together over a challenge no one could conquer. A jar of pickles made us a team, even if we all failed miserably. And you know what? That's the lesson. Sometimes life hands you battles you can't win. You can try every trick in the book, enlist every helper in your orbit, and still end up defeated. But if you're lucky, the fight itself becomes the story. The laughter, the camaraderie, the absurdity of it all. So, here's my question. What's your equivalent of the cursed pickle jar? What's the ridiculous, seemingly small moment that brought people together, or brought you a little closer to laughing at yourself? I'd love to hear it. Let's start a new story. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just another Sunday spent clearing out the detritus of someone else's life. My friend Sarah had inherited her great aunt's house, a sprawling Victorian that leaned more toward haunted than historic, and I'd agreed to help sort through the endless piles of junk her aunt had amassed over decades. The place smelled faintly of mildew and time, as if the walls themselves had been storing memories like dust in the cracks. I'd found myself alone in the attic, a cavernous space filled with ancient trunks and leaning shelves of forgotten things. Light filtered through a cracked window, its beams cutting through the musty gloom like hesitant explorers. I was poking around the edges of a shelf when I spotted it. A cardboard box, unlabeled and tucked behind an old sewing machine. Inside was something entirely unremarkable at first glance. A stack of vinyl records, their edges scuffed, the sleeves curling at the corners. I thumbed through them idly, half expecting to find nothing more than the usual dusty relics of someone else's soundtrack. And then I saw it. A record without a label, its black surface glossy and pristine, as if it had somehow avoided the ravages of time that had claimed everything else in the attic. I don't know why I decided to take it home. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the feeling I couldn't quite name, the sense that the record was waiting for someone, me specifically, to find it. That night, long after the sun had set and the world outside my apartment had gone quiet, I slid the record from its sleeve and set it gently on the turntable. As the needle dropped, I braced myself for crackling silence or some forgotten crooner's tinny lament. But what I heard was something else entirely. The first note rang out like a bell, deep and resonant, a sound that filled the room in a way music isn't supposed to, not just heard, but felt like a ripple moving through the air, through my chest, through my very bones. It was a song I didn't recognize, but at the same time, it was unmistakably familiar. The melody wove itself around me, pulling me somewhere far away, somewhere I couldn't see, but could feel with perfect clarity. Suddenly, I was a child again, not in the metaphorical sense. Not in the way people say they feel transported by music. I was there in my grandmother's garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in watercolor streaks of orange and pink, and the air was warm and heavy with the scent of lilacs. I could feel the grass under my bare feet, soft and damp, and hear the faint rustling of leaves as a breeze moved through the hedges. And there she was, my grandmother. She sat in her favorite chair, a worn wicker thing with a cushion that had long since lost its fluff, and she was humming. That same melody, the one pouring out of the record now, was spilling from her lips in quiet, broken snatches. She was knitting something I couldn't see, her hands moving with a rhythm that matched the tune, her face serene and glowing in the fading light. She looked up at me and smiled, a small, knowing smile, as if she'd been expecting me all along. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was gone. The music stopped. The room went quiet, and I was back in my apartment, the record spinning lazily to a stop. My heart was pounding, my hands trembling, and I sat there staring at the turntable as if it might explain what had just happened. I tried to play the record again, but this time there was nothing. No sound, no melody, just the faint scratch of the needle against its surface. It was as if whatever magic it held had been spent in that one moment, used up like a match burning too brightly before fading into smoke. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind kept circling back to that garden, to the smell of lilacs, to the way my grandmother had looked at me as though I was meant to be there. I started to wonder, was it a memory? Or was it something else entirely? A gift, a glimpse into a world that only existed in the notes of that impossible song? The next morning, I went back to Sarah's great-aunt's house. I scoured the attic, the basement, every creaky floorboard in between, looking for anything that might connect to the record. But there was nothing. No explanation, no answers. Just more unanswered questions left to gather dust. I still have the record. It sits on my bookshelf now. In its unmarked sleeve, a mystery waiting for a key I may never find. I haven't tried to play it again. I'm not sure I could bear the silence if it didn't work, and I'm even less sure what I'd do if it did. But sometimes, late at night, I'll catch the faintest echo of that melody in my mind, so clear and sharp that I have to stop whatever I'm doing to listen. It doesn't fade the way memories usually do. Instead, it feels like it's alive, pulsing faintly just beyond the edge of my reach, a reminder that some moments aren't meant to be explained. They're just meant to be felt. What about you? Have you ever found something that seemed impossible? Something that made you wonder if the world is holding more magic than we let ourselves believe? Let's start a new story. It started with a missing apple pie. Not the store-bought kind, but one of those homemade beauties with a lattice crust so perfect you almost feel bad eating it. Almost. It was my grandma's recipe, though I'd never actually made one myself before that night. I'd spent the whole afternoon rolling out dough, cursing at the rolling pin, and Googling how to know if apples are too mushy for baking. When the timer dinged, the pie was golden, steaming, and if I'm honest, the most beautiful thing I'd ever made. And then it vanished. I left it cooling on the windowsill, because that's what you're supposed to do with pies, right? It's practically a law of nature, like gravity or always running out of coffee at the worst moment. I stepped away for 5 minutes, just 5, and when I came back, it was gone. At first, I thought I was losing it. Maybe I'd set it on the counter instead? But no, there was the empty windowsill, a dusting of flour on the floor beneath it, and nothing else. I leaned out the window, scanning the yard, and that's when I saw it. A single sticky trail of filling leading into the woods behind my house. Now, I'm not an impulsive person. I'm the kind of person who checks Yelp reviews before trying a new pizza place and rereads text messages 3 times before hitting send. But there was something about that trail, about the absurdity of a stolen pie, that made me grab a flashlight and follow it. The woods behind my house aren't deep, maybe half a mile across, but at night, they might as well be a forest from a Brothers Grimm story. My flashlight flickered as I stepped over roots and brambles, my sneakers crunching on dried leaves. The trail wasn't much, just a few smudges of filling here and there, but it was enough to keep me moving. And then, just as I started to think this was the stupidest idea I'd ever had, I saw it. The pie, or what was left of it, anyway. It was sitting in the middle of a small clearing, half-eaten, with chunks of crust scattered like breadcrumbs. And next to it was a raccoon. At least I thought it was a raccoon at first. But it was too big, too scruffy. And when it turned its head to look at me, its eyes glowed in a way that wasn't just reflective. It was almost intelligent. I froze, unsure whether to laugh or back away slowly. Seriously? I said, more to myself than to the creature. You stole my pie? The not raccoon tilted its head, like it was considering the question. Then, to my absolute shock, it spoke. Good pie, it said in a voice that sounded like gravel scraping over metal. Not loud, but deliberate, as if it hadn't spoken in a very long time. I don't remember dropping the flashlight, but I must have, because suddenly the clearing was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the moon. My heart was pounding, and every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to leave. But another part, the part that had followed the pie trail into the woods, was curious. Thanks, I said, because what else do you say when a mythical forest creature compliments your baking? It nodded, like this was a perfectly normal exchange, and then gestured to the remains of the pie with one clawed paw. Trade? Trade? Trade for what? It reached into the shadows beside it and pulled out a small, perfectly round stone. It was smooth, almost glowing, and when it rolled it toward me, it made a soft humming sound. For another pie, it said. I stared at the stone, then at the creature, then back at the stone. You want me to make you another pie in exchange for this rock? Not rock, it said, almost offended. Key. Key to what? It didn't answer. Instead, it nudged the stone closer, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Now, if I were a smarter person, I would have walked away. But something about the stone and the creature and the impossibility of the whole situation kept me rooted in place. So I picked up the stone. It was warm in my hand, and the hum grew louder, almost like it was alive. The creature gave a satisfied grunt, then stood, its scruffy fur shimmering in the moonlight. Next pie, it said, before disappearing into the shadows. I don't know how long I stood there, clutching that strange, humming stone, before I finally made my way back home. The pie was gone, of course, and when I checked the windowsill, there were muddy paw prints where it had been. But the stone was real, sitting heavy and warm in my pocket. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the creature, or the key, or what might happen if I actually made another pie. I told myself it was crazy, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But late one night, as I was turning the stone over in my hand, I heard the faintest sound, a hum, like distant music. And when I held the stone to my ear, it wasn't just music. It was a voice, soft and urgent, whispering, "Bake." So I did. A week later, I set another pie on the windowsill and waited. This time, I wasn't surprised when it disappeared. I wasn't even surprised when I found another trail leading into the woods. But what I found at the end of that trail, that's a story I'm still trying to wrap my head around. So, tell me, have you ever stumbled into something so strange, so impossible, that it changed the way you see the world? Let's start a new story. It began with a bell. Not a big, ceremonial bell. No, this one was small, delicate, the kind you might hang from the neck of a mischievous cat. I first heard it while walking home from the grocery store, its clear chime cutting through the damp evening air. The sound stopped me mid-step. I turned, groceries swinging in my hands, but the sidewalk behind me was empty. Then it rang again, closer this time. I turned the other way and found it lying there, right in my path, a silver bell no bigger than a walnut. It shone impossibly bright, as if it had been freshly polished despite the rainy mist clinging to everything else. A thin red ribbon was looped through its handle, and as I bent down to pick it up, I noticed the ribbon wasn't wet. It was as dry as summer sunlight. The bell fit neatly in my palm, warm and heavier than I expected. I rang it experimentally, and the sound wasn't just clear, it was sharp, like it had sliced through the air, leaving a faint ripple behind. It felt alive, somehow, as though it were breathing in sync with my own quickened pulse. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. The streetlights had flickered off, every single one, and the rain had stopped, not gradually, but all at once, as though someone had pressed pause on the weather itself. Even the puddles on the sidewalk were perfectly still, their surfaces smooth as glass. The only sound was the faint hum of the bell, still vibrating in my hand. A figure stepped out from the shadows of an alleyway. They were tall, their silhouette unervingly thin, and their face was obscured by a hood that seemed too deep to be natural. Their movement wasn't threatening, but it wasn't quite right either, too fluid, as if their limbs bent in ways mine didn't. I gripped the bell instinctively, though I wasn't sure why. "You've been chosen," they said. Their voice was like the bell, sharp, clear, and ringing in my ears long after the words had passed. "The question awaits." "What question?" I asked, my voice sounding small against the unnatural silence. They tilted their head, as if the answer should have been obvious. The question of what comes next. Then they extended a hand, long, pale fingers beckoning me forward. "But only if you ring the bell." I should have dropped it right there. I should have turned around and walked home, unpacked my groceries, and gone to bed pretending none of this ever happened. But the bell seemed to hum again, its warmth pulsing faintly in my palm, and I knew it wasn't that simple. So, I rang it. The sound was louder this time, impossibly so. It didn't just cut through the air. It rearranged it, bending the street and the sky into a shimmering whirlpool of sound and light. The figure stepped back, gesturing for me to follow as the world around us twisted into something new. When the light cleared, we were no longer on my street, or any street, for that matter. The ground beneath us was soft and mossy, stretching out in every direction like an endless forest floor. The air was thick and golden, filled with motes of light that floated lazily like dandelion seeds. Trees towered overhead, but their trunks were translucent, their branches crisscrossing like veins filled with glowing liquid. Somewhere far off, another bell chimed, its tone deeper and slower than the one in my hand. "What is this place?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "The threshold," the figure replied. "Every choice you make rings a bell. Most fade into the background, forgotten. But this one was heard." They stepped closer, and for the first time, I caught a glimpse beneath their hood. Their face wasn't really a face at all. It was a shifting surface of light and shadow, like sunlight on water. Eyes flickered briefly into existence, then dissolved again, leaving only the suggestion of a smile. "You are here to answer," they continued. "The question is not for me to ask. It is yours, and yours alone." I looked down at the bell in my hand, its silver surface now faintly glowing. "I don't understand." "Not yet," they said simply. "But you will." Then they were gone, vanishing as if they'd never existed. I was alone in the golden forest, the bell still warm in my hand. The other chime, the deeper one, rang again, and this time it seemed to come from just ahead. Without thinking, I began to walk. The path wound through the trees, though it wasn't a path in the traditional sense. Just patches of moss that felt slightly firmer beneath my feet, guiding me forward. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, thick with a strange, honey-like sweetness that made every breath feel significant. Finally, I reached a clearing. In its center stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal was another bell. This one was enormous, easily taller than me, with a bronze surface carved with intricate patterns, stars, waves, spirals, and shapes I couldn't quite identify. Beside it stood another figure, smaller than the first, but no less strange. Their skin shimmered like oil on water, and their eyes, when they looked at me, seemed to reflect not just my face, but my entire life. "You've brought it," they said, gesturing to the silver bell in my hand. I nodded, unsure what else to do. They stepped closer, extending a hand. "May I?" Reluctantly, I handed it over. They held it delicately, as if it were a rare jewel, and then placed it on the pedestal beside the bronze bell. The two bells began to hum in unison, their tones weaving together into something too beautiful, too overwhelming to describe. "You have a choice," the figure said. "Ring the bronze bell, and the world you know will shift. It will not be destroyed, but it will not remain the same. Or turn back now, and your life will go on as it has, unchanged." I stared at the bronze bell, its patterns seeming to shift under my gaze. I thought of my small, ordinary apartment, my quiet, predictable routines, and the strange emptiness I hadn't realized I carried until this moment. The air buzzed with possibility. My voice faltered. "What happens if I ring it?" The figure tilted their head, their expression unreadable. "Something new." The choice was mine. And as I stood there, the silver bell began to hum again, faint but insistent, as if urging me forward. Let's start a new story. It began with the letters. They arrived on my doorstep, one every morning, each in a plain white envelope with no return address. The first was empty, just a sheet of blank paper folded with a precision that felt unnerving, as if it were a message in itself. The second had a single word written in tight, deliberate handwriting, soon. By the fifth letter, I was no longer brushing it off as a prank. That one contained a pressed flower, dark and fragile, with petals shaped like crescent moons. Beneath it was a line of text that read, "Go to where the wind stands still." I didn't know what that meant, but something about the letters, their strangeness, their weight, lodged itself under my skin. They felt alive, magnetic, like a secret meant only for me. By the time the seventh letter arrived, with coordinates scrawled in red ink, I knew I was going. The location was a nowhere place, a patch of woods miles from the nearest town, tucked behind hills that seemed to hunch forward like shoulders bracing against the wind. I parked on the side of an unmarked road, the car's tires sinking slightly into the loose dirt, and stared at the tree line ahead. It looked ordinary, except for the faintest shimmer, like heat rising off pavement. But this wasn't heat. It was cold, a bite in the air that grew sharper the closer I walked. The shimmer turned out to be a doorway. Not a door, but a doorway, standing there unsupported, made of dark stone veined with silver. Through it, I could see the woods continuing, but distorted, like a reflection in rippling water. I hesitated. What kind of person walks into something like that? And yet, I knew I couldn't turn back. The letters hadn't just been instructions. They'd been invitations, promises. I stepped through. The shift was immediate, like walking into another version of the world. The trees were taller here, impossibly so, their trunks etched with faint glowing patterns that pulsed in time with the faint hum in the air. The ground was soft, mossy, and the light was strange. Neither day nor night, but something in between, as if the sky couldn't make up its mind. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling leaves, just the hum, deep and resonant, vibrating in my chest. The path wound forward, not carved by hands, but by something older, its edges lined with stones that looked like they had grown there rather than been placed. I followed it, feeling more like I was being pulled than walking. At times, the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches arching overhead like the ceiling of a cathedral. Then I reached the clearing. At the center was a table, hewn from the same dark stone as the doorway. Around it stood 5 chairs, all empty. And at the far edge of the clearing, leaning against a tree, was a man in a coat that shimmered like the surface of a black lake. He wasn't waiting. He was watching, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. "You made it," he said, his voice low and calm, as if we'd known each other for years. "Made it to what?" I asked. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the weight of the place. "To the game," he replied, stepping forward. His movements were fluid, almost inhuman. "You've been chosen, whether you like it or not." "Chosen for what?" "For what comes next." He gestured to the table, and I noticed something I hadn't before. A small box sitting at its center, simple but immaculate, its surface glinting faintly in the strange light. I approached slowly, the hum growing louder with every step, until I stood before it. The man said nothing, only watched. When I opened the box, I expected something dramatic, a burst of light, a voice, an explanation. Instead, there was only an object, a watch. Its face was cracked, its hands frozen at a time I didn't recognize. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my palm, and as soon as I did, the hum shifted. It wasn't louder, but sharper, more insistent. "What is this?" I asked, turning to the man, but he was no longer there. The clearing was empty, the chairs gone, the table now nothing more than a smooth stone slab. The path behind me had vanished, replaced by a thicket of trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The watch ticked once, a sound that echoed like a bell, and suddenly, I wasn't alone. They appeared at the edges of the clearing. Figures cloaked in shadow, their forms barely distinguishable, but undeniably human. They moved with purpose, circling me, their faces obscured by masks carved from something that looked like bone. One stepped closer, holding out their hand. "The watch," they said, their voice layered, as if several people were speaking in unison. "You must decide." "Decide what?" I asked, but they didn't answer. Instead, they extended their hand further, waiting. The hum was deafening now, a vibration that felt like it was splitting me apart. My instinct screamed to drop the watch, to run, but something deeper held me in place. This wasn't just a decision. It was the decision, the kind that leaves everything before it meaningless and everything after it inevitable. I held the watch out, just inches from their grasp, and then I stopped. "No," I said, and as soon as I spoke the word, the hum stopped. The figures froze, the air itself stilled, and the light in the clearing shifted. For a moment, the world was utterly silent. Then the figures stepped back, one by one, dissolving into the shadows. The clearing brightened, the trees pulling away to reveal the path again, and in the distance, I saw the shimmer of the doorway. When I stepped back into the world I knew, the watch was still in my hand, its hands moving now, ticking in rhythm with my heartbeat. There was no sign of the letters, the man, or the clearing. But the hum, faint and distant, stayed with me, a reminder that the game wasn't over. Not yet. Have you ever felt like you've been nudged toward a choice you didn't fully understand? A moment that asked you to trust yourself, even if you didn't know why? And if it came again, would you do the same? Let's start a new story. Specifically, a single, lonely sock I found on the sidewalk during my morning run. It wasn't even a remarkable sock, plain, gray, a little threadbare at the heel, but it sparked something in my brain I couldn't shake. I kept imagining the story behind it. Was someone rushing out the door, holding their laundry precariously, when it made a daring escape? Did it leap from the back of a truck like an action hero? Or had it simply decided to part ways with its mate, striking out into the world for a life of freedom and adventure? I couldn't decide which idea I liked more. And then, like some cosmic prank, I started seeing them everywhere. Not the same sock, obviously, but others. On curbs in parking lots, draped over fences like flags signaling surrender. Each one felt like a tiny mystery begging to be solved. I started snapping photos of them, my phone quietly filling up with what I later referred to as the Sock Chronicles. It wasn't a hobby I'd chosen, exactly, but one that had chosen me. I mean, when the universe repeatedly delivers stray footwear to your path, what are you supposed to do? Ignore it? It wasn't until much later, sitting in a coffee shop and scrolling through my growing collection, that I realized how much I'd leaned into this absurd little project. And as I watched a latte foam heart slowly dissolve in my cup, it hit me how much of my life had become like this. Peppered with strange, unintended fascinations that felt too silly to explain, but too delightful to give up. Like my obsession with the package tracking emails I get whenever I order something online. They've become little serialized dramas in my inbox. Your package has left the warehouse, one proclaims, a triumphant beginning to the story. Your package is in transit, comes next, the narrative reaching its thrilling midpoint. But the best part is always the end. Your package has been delivered. That's when I imagine my delivery guy standing in front of my door, basking in his small victory like a knight who's slain a particularly stubborn dragon. It's ridiculous, sure, but I can't help feeling a spark of joy every time it happens. And let's not even get started on the actual deliveries. A few weeks ago, I ordered a kitchen gadget I didn't even need, a weird little avocado slicer that promised to make my guacamole dreams come true. When it arrived, it came in a box roughly the size of a small suitcase, complete with yards of bubble wrap and an inexplicably tiny manual in 6 languages. I stood there in my kitchen, holding this over-engineered piece of plastic, and burst out laughing. It wasn't just the absurdity of it all. It was the fact that I was genuinely excited about it, like it was some rare artifact instead of something I could have done with a knife and a little effort. Of course, technology has its own ideas about what I should care about. My smart speaker, for example, has started recommending music to me based on things I've said. The other day, I casually mentioned that I missed the sound of rain, and now my playlists are full of lo-fi beats with thunderstorm soundscapes. Part of me is impressed by its attentiveness. The other part is vaguely creeped out. It's like living with a roommate who overhears your dreams and tries to make them come true without asking. And then there's the utterly baffling world of notifications. I got one last week that said, "You've taken 4,872 steps today. Great job." I stared at it for a moment, genuinely unsure if I was being praised or politely scolded for not rounding up to 5,000. Meanwhile, another app informed me that I hadn't logged my mood in 6 days. My mood, as if failing to record whether I felt neutral or slightly optimistic was some kind of personal betrayal. I don't even remember downloading that app. Now it sends me reminders like an overbearing life coach I didn't ask for but kind of need. But honestly, for all its quirks, modern life has this weird charm I can't resist. There's something magical about the way we've turned tiny, insignificant moments into rituals worth savoring. Like the way I'll spend 10 minutes trying to decide which reaction emoji to use on a friend's text, agonizing over whether a simple thumbs up feels too cold or if the crying laughing face is overused. Or how my neighborhood group chat has evolved into a soap opera of epic proportions, complete with debates over lawn decorations and an ongoing mystery about who keeps leaving zucchini on people's porches. We've nicknamed them the Phantom Squasher, and frankly, it's the most compelling subplot in my life right now. Even the everyday absurdities feel strangely poetic. Like the fact that I can scroll through Instagram and see someone's lovingly curated photo of a perfectly plated avocado toast, then scroll 3 posts later to a video of a raccoon trying to fit itself into a shoebox. Or the unspoken agreement we all seem to have to text each other links to bizarre news articles without comment, trusting the other person to find the humor in it. Man buys $400 parrot, discovers it knows 40 swear words. I mean, come on, that's art. What gets me, though, is how quickly it's all become second nature. The way I now instinctively swipe through screens, adjust my smart thermostat with a tap, or laugh out loud at a TikTok while lying on the floor, knowing full well I'll forget it 5 minutes later. It's ridiculous and fleeting and messy, but it's also kind of wonderful. There's this deep, unexpected joy in the small things. Finding humor in stray socks, excitement in overly packaged avocados, and connection in shared absurdities. So here I am, living in a world where my phone reminds me to hydrate, my fridge nags me about leftovers, and every corner of my life seems to hum with the quiet, persistent buzz of technology. It's imperfect, yes, but it's also endlessly fascinating, like a jigsaw puzzle with a few missing pieces. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. What about you? What's a strange little thing in your life that makes you pause and smile, even when you don't quite know why? Let's start a new story. Every Thursday at exactly 8:14 p.m., we danced. Not in a studio, or at a party, or anywhere that made sense. We danced in our living room, amid a chaos of mismatched furniture, dog hair, and the faint smell of coffee that never quite left the walls. It didn't matter what else was going on. Dishes in the sink, emails waiting to be answered, the world tilting on its axis. At 8:14, the music would start, and we would move. It began by accident, like most things worth keeping. One night, after a particularly long day, she was scrolling through her playlists, hunting for something to drown out the world. She landed on a song, one of those jazzy, swing numbers with horns that felt like liquid energy, and, without warning, grabbed my hand. "Dance with me," she said. "I don't dance," I protested because that had always been true. "Now you do," she said, pulling me off the couch with a grin so infectious I didn't even fight her. It was clumsy at first. I stepped on her toes, tripped over the corner of the rug, and almost knocked over a lamp. But she just laughed, spinning me around like we were in some black and white movie, her hair catching the light in a way that made her look like she was glowing. By the end of the song, we were breathless, tangled in each other's arms. The day's heaviness melted into the floorboards. The next Thursday, the same thing happened. This time, she didn't even ask. She just turned on the song, her eyes daring me to say no. I didn't. From then on, it became a thing. Every Thursday, without fail, we'd clear a tiny space in the cluttered room and dance. Some nights it was swing. Other nights it was salsa or blues or whatever song caught her mood. She'd lead, then I'd lead, then we'd both give up and just sway, laughing when the rhythm slipped away from us. One Thursday, it rained so hard the power went out. The clock stopped. The world plunged into a strange, timeless dark. I figured we'd skip it that week, but she wouldn't hear of it. "It's still Thursday," she said, lighting a candle and humming a tune I didn't recognize. She took my hands and started to move, slow and steady, the flickering light casting our shadows on the walls. I don't think we'd ever dance better. The thing about rituals is that they sneak up on you. What starts as a simple moment, something you don't think twice about, becomes a thread that holds your life together. Our Thursday dances were that thread. They carried us through everything. New jobs, bad days, fights that left us raw and tender. No matter what, when 8:14 rolled around, the music would play, and we'd remember why we chose each other. One night, She wasn't home. She'd texted earlier, stuck at work, apologizing 100 times for breaking the streak. I told her it was fine, that I'd see her when she got back. But when 8:14 came, I couldn't help myself. I turned on the music and danced alone, my feet moving into patterns we'd made together. It wasn't the same, of course. It felt more like a shadow of the real thing. But it was enough to hold me over until she returned. She found me like that when she came in, swaying by myself in the half-lit room. She dropped her bag, kicked off her shoes, and joined me without a word. We didn't speak. We just moved, the weight of the day slipping off our shoulders as the music wrapped around us. The years added up, and the dances changed with them. There were weeks when she danced with a slight limp after an old injury flared up, and others when I couldn't keep up because my back was stiff from hours hunched over a desk. We didn't mind. The point wasn't perfection. It was showing up together no matter how life tried to pull us apart. On our 10th anniversary, I made a playlist of all the songs we'd danced to over the years. I didn't tell her. I just waited for 8:14, then hit play. The first song came on, that same jazzy swing number from our first dance, and she froze, her face breaking into a grin so bright it felt like sunlight. "You remembered," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "Of course I did," I said. We danced that night like it was the first time, our steps as awkward and beautiful as ever. When the last song faded, we didn't let go, just stood there in the quiet, holding each other like the world could end and we wouldn't care. Now, even when life pulls us in different directions, I know that Thursday will come. And at 8:14, wherever we are, we'll dance. What about you? What rituals keep your heart moving? Let's start a new story. The other day, I stumbled upon a scene so strange and beautiful that it felt like I'd wandered into the opening chapter of a novel. I was cutting through an alley behind a row of old brick shops. One of those narrow, forgotten shortcuts that smells faintly of rain and paint thinner. A little ahead of me, a man in a bright yellow jacket stood in front of a wall covered in graffiti, the kind of chaotic layering that only decades of tags and posters could create. But what made me stop was what he was doing. He had a pocket full of stickers, those shiny, reflective kind that kids trade on playgrounds, and he was carefully, methodically placing them over the cracks in the wall, almost like a repairman patching up holes. He'd step back after each one, tilting his head to judge the placement, then nod like he'd nailed it. I couldn't help myself. "What are you doing?" I called out, half expecting him to tell me to mind my business. He turned with a huge grin, his face lined and weathered in that way that suggested a life lived in full color. "Fixing it," he said, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. "Fixing it," I echoed, walking closer. Up close, I could see that the stickers were tiny suns and stars, each one catching the light in a way that made the whole wall shimmer. "Yeah," he said, patting the wall affectionately. "Too much anger on these bricks. Too much shouting. Thought I'd give it a little hope." I stood there, dumbfounded, as he went back to work, humming a tune I didn't recognize. By the time he was done, the wall looked like it had been kissed by some cosmic accident. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was mesmerizing, a patchwork of light and shadow, chaos and care. He dusted his hands off, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "You should try it sometime. The world's got cracks everywhere, but they're begging to be filled with something brighter." And then, just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone with a wall full of tiny suns and the distinct feeling that I'd just witnessed something profound. Later that evening, I found myself thinking about him while scrolling through a thread about weird hobbies. People were posting pictures of things they'd made. A chair entirely out of bottle caps, intricate sculptures carved from soap bars, a diorama someone had built inside a shoebox to recreate their grandparents' living room. The comments were full of people cheering each other on, strangers hyping up these odd little projects with the kind of enthusiasm you'd expect for the unveiling of a new museum exhibit. It made me think about how, even in the most mundane moments, people are constantly trying to leave things better than they found them, often in ways that seem small or ridiculous at first glance. Like the guy I saw at a bus stop a few months ago. He was holding a handful of little origami animals, frogs, cranes, even a tiny dragon, and handing them out to anyone who looked like they needed a lift. I didn't take one, but I watched a woman who did. She sat down on the bench, holding the paper crane like it was made of gold, her whole face softening in a way that made me feel like I'd intruded on something private. Or the woman I once saw in the park, knitting scarves for lampposts. Not for people, lampposts. She said it was called yarn bombing, and that it was her way of giving the cold city a hug. I remember laughing at the absurdity of it. But when I walked back through the park a few weeks later, those lampposts, wrapped in colorful yarn, did feel warmer somehow, like they were alive and part of the scenery. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how often people do this kind of thing, quiet acts of rebellion against the ordinary. A teenager chalking poetry on a sidewalk before the rain washes it away. Someone leaving a book on a park bench with a note that says, "Take me, I want to travel." A busker playing a violin solo in a subway station. The music's so haunting it makes everyone stop pretending they're too busy to listen. I've started noticing these moments more now, like I've tuned into a secret frequency. Just the other day, I watched a man at the dog park carefully tie a little red bandana around his dog's neck. It wasn't for function, just flair. The dog looked ridiculous, but also proud, trotting around like it knew it was the best-dressed creature for miles. The owner, meanwhile, looked happier than I'd ever seen anyone tying a piece of fabric. It's like the universe is full of these tiny rebellions against the dullness of routine, and every single one of them feels like a little gift if you stop long enough to notice. The guy with the stickers, the origami animals, the yarn bombs, they're all proof that people are constantly trying to sneak beauty into the cracks, to leave behind some faint trace of joy or wonder, no matter how fleeting. So now I have to ask, have you ever stumbled across a moment like that? Something so unexpected and quietly magical that it felt like the world itself was winking at you? Let's start a new story. The letter arrived in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It fluttered down onto my breakfast plate like a leaf blown in by the wind. Except the windows were closed, and I live on the 12th floor of a very boring apartment building. It landed right in the middle of my toast, the edges curling slightly as though it had traveled a long way. The envelope was a pale lavender, sealed with a golden wax emblem of a crescent moon surrounded by stars. I stared at it for a solid minute, the butter knife in my hand frozen midair. My mail didn't just appear. It usually came with junk flyers or angry red notices from the landlord. This was different. Finally, I set the knife down and picked up the envelope. It smelled faintly of rain and something sweeter, like jasmine. My name was written on it in looping silver script. To the wanderer who waits. I tore it open, the wax seal breaking with a satisfying crack. Inside was a single sheet of thick, velvety paper. The message was short and maddeningly vague. The door appears only once. If you're ready, step through. The key is where the world folds. I flipped the paper over. Nothing. No address, no signature, no secret code when I held it to the light. Just those words, sitting smugly in their cryptic little sentence. That should have been the end of it. A weird prank, maybe, but the phrase stuck with me. Where the world folds. It burrowed into my brain like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. I thought about it at work, on the subway, even as I brushed my teeth. It felt right, familiar, like something I should already understand. The next day, I noticed the tear in the air. It was subtle at first, like catching movement out of the corner of your eye, except nothing was there when you turned to look. I was walking home, the streetlights buzzing faintly as I passed, when I saw it, a faint shimmer near the base of an old oak tree by the park. I stopped, tilted my head. The shimmer flickered, almost apologetically, and then it was gone. But the next evening, it was there again. Stronger this time. A thin, vertical seam in the air, barely visible but undeniably wrong, as if the world's fabric had come undone at that one precise spot. My heart pounded as I approached it. There was no heat, no chill, no sound, just that shimmer waiting for me to notice. And in my pocket, without me remembering how it got there, was a key. It wasn't like any key I'd ever seen. It was long, slender, and slightly curved, made of a black metal that caught the light in strange ways, as if it couldn't decide whether to reflect or absorb it. It fit perfectly into the seam, The moment it clicked, the world rippled, folding inward like pages of a book turning themselves. And then I was somewhere else. The first thing I noticed was the color. It was richer, deeper, more alive than anything I'd ever seen. The sky was a shifting palette of golds and purples, streaked with threads of light that danced and hummed like a melody just out of reach. The air felt heavier, warmer, as though it carried a weight I couldn't quite name. Beneath my feet was a field of soft, iridescent grass that shimmered with every step, leaving faint trails of silver where I walked. Ahead of me was a door, freestanding. No walls, no hinges, just a weathered wooden door covered in carvings that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. They showed impossible things, clouds shaped like animals, rivers that flowed upward, stars blooming into flowers. My hand moved before I could think, pushing the door open. On the other side was everything. A marketplace stretched out before me, though marketplace feels inadequate. The stalls were made of materials I couldn't name, woven light perhaps, or something like molten glass. And they sold things I didn't understand. One vendor held out a jar of laughter, the sound inside bubbling faintly like soda. Another offered threads of shadow, coiled neatly like yarn. A towering figure with skin like polished bronze gestured to a basket of tiny bottled storms, their corks vibrating as thunder rumbled faintly inside. First time, a voice asked. I turned to find a young man standing beside me. He was dressed in what I can only describe as patchwork elegance, a coat made of mismatched pieces of fabric that shimmered and shifted with every move. His eyes were strange, one golden, one dark as a moonless night. Yeah, I said, still trying to process the sheer wrong rightness of the place. What is this? He smiled, a crooked thing that was both reassuring and slightly unnerving. This is the Midway, where all the doors lead, if you know how to listen, where travelers come to trade. Trade what? Anything you're willing to lose, he said, gesturing broadly at the stalls. Memories, dreams, a year of your life. It's all currency here. I instinctively gripped the pocket with my wallet, which felt laughably useless now. I don't think I'm supposed to be here. Yet here you are, he said, with a shrug that somehow managed to feel like a challenge. The door wouldn't have opened if you weren't. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the hum of the place, the colors, the sounds, the sheer aliveness, was intoxicating. I wandered the market, marveling at things I couldn't begin to understand. A woman with hair like spun copper offered me a handful of stars for the price of a forgotten fear. A child with butterfly wings whispered about a map to places no one had ever seen. I didn't take anything. Not yet, but I couldn't stop looking. Eventually, I found myself back at the door. It stood waiting, still carved with its shifting patterns. The man in the patchwork coat leaned casually against it, as though he'd been expecting me. Leaving already? He asked, raising an eyebrow. I don't even know what I'm doing here, I admitted. He tilted his head, considering me. Maybe not, but the door thought you were ready, and doors don't usually make mistakes. I stepped through without saying goodbye, and the world unfolded again. I was back in my apartment, the clock on my microwave blinking as if nothing had happened. The key was gone, the shimmer by the tree no longer visible. But every so often, I catch a faint hum in the air, like a melody I almost remember. And sometimes when the wind shifts just right, I swear I smell rain and jasmine. Let's start a new story. Not my coat, but one left hanging on the back of a chair at a cafe where I'd gone to escape the rain. It was a thick olive green thing, the kind that looks like it's seen more hiking trails than dry cleaners. I wouldn't have paid it much attention if not for the fact that the cafe was about to close, and the coat's owner was nowhere to be found. I pointed it out to the barista, who shrugged and said, "Lost and found's full. Someone will grab it tomorrow." Normally, I'd have walked away, but something about the coat nagged at me. It was battered but clean, and a pair of gloves poked out from one of the pockets, red wool, and clearly handmade. It didn't feel like something someone would just forget. So, on impulse I couldn't explain, I grabbed it. The moment I stepped back into the rain, I regretted it. What was I going to do with someone else's coat? Sell it? Take it to a shelter? I almost turned around to return it, but then my fingers brushed something in the other pocket, a folded sheet of paper. I stopped under the glow of a flickering street lamp and pulled it out. The paper was soft and creased, the kind that's been carried around for a long time. On it was a map, not a Google map or a tourist map, but a hand-drawn one, with little symbols scattered across its surface. A star here, a squiggly line there. It looked old, edges browned, corners frayed, but the ink was vibrant, the kind that stains your fingers if you touch it too long. And at the bottom, in neat block letters, "Meet me at the lighthouse. Midnight. Bring the coat." I laughed out loud, earning a curious glance from a passerby under an umbrella. This was ridiculous. What lighthouse? This city didn't have one. The nearest lighthouse was miles away, perched on a cliff overlooking the sea. It was a 3-hour drive, assuming I even wanted to go, which I absolutely did not. Yet the word stuck in my head. Midnight. The coat. So, naturally I went. I drove through the rain, the coat sitting heavy in the passenger seat like a sleeping passenger. The map didn't make much sense at first, but after squinting at it during a stop for gas, I realized it didn't mark roads. It marked landmarks. A crooked tree, a wooden bridge, a windmill with no blades. Following it felt like stepping into a scavenger hunt designed by someone with a very strange sense of humor. By the time I reached the lighthouse, the rain had stopped, and the moon was hanging low over the ocean, big and yellow and too bright to look at directly. The lighthouse itself was old and crumbling, its beam long extinguished. The door at the base was slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. "Hello," I called, stepping inside. My voice echoed off the stone walls, and I suddenly felt like an idiot. Maybe this was a prank. Maybe I'd find a group of teenagers laughing at me from the shadows. But no one appeared. I climbed the spiral staircase, the coat slung over my arm, my footsteps clanging against the metal steps. At the top, the room was empty except for a lantern and a small wooden table. And on the table, another note. This one said, "Look outside." The window stretched almost floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the cliffs and the sea. For a moment, I saw nothing unusual, just waves crashing against the rocks below. Then, out on the water, I spotted it, a tiny rowboat, its lantern bobbing like a firefly. It was coming closer. I froze, gripping the back of the chair beside me. The boat reached the shore, and someone stepped out. They were wrapped in a black coat, their hood pulled tight, and they moved with a purpose, heading straight for the lighthouse. I heard the door creak below, followed by footsteps ascending the stairs. A million thoughts collided in my head. Was this the coat's owner? A trick? Something worse? I thought about running, but didn't. Instead, I stood there, heart pounding, as the footsteps grew louder. The person emerged, dripping seawater onto the floor. They pushed back their hood, revealing a woman with short, dark hair and a face etched with exhaustion and relief. She looked at me, then at the coat, and finally said, "You're not who I was expecting." Likewise, I managed. She stepped forward, took the coat gently from my hands, and began rifling through the pockets. When she found what she was looking for, a small leather notebook, she sighed, closed her eyes, and clutched it to her chest. "Thank you," she said. "You have no idea how important this is." "What is it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. She hesitated, then offered me a tired smile. "A story for another time." And just like that, she was gone, back down the stairs, back to the rowboat, back out to sea. By the time I made it back to the window, the boat was already a distant speck, its lantern swallowed by the dark. I drove home in silence, the map sitting on the passenger seat where the coat had been. I still don't know who she was, or what was in that notebook, or why I had to be the one to deliver it. But sometimes, when it's late and I'm restless, I take out the map and trace its lines with my finger, wondering if it might lead me somewhere else. Somewhere I haven't been yet. Have you ever found yourself pulled into someone else's story, only to be left with more questions than answers? Let's start a new story. I woke up to find that my ceiling had vanished. In its place was a vast expanse of sky. Not the usual kind, with clouds and sunlight, but something utterly alien. The colors shimmered like spilled gasoline, and constellations I didn't recognize blinked lazily, as if waking up alongside me. When I sat up, my bed groaned. "Finally," it said in a voice like creaking wood. "You were out cold." I was starting to worry. This wasn't the strangest thing. My bed and I had these sorts of conversations occasionally. It liked to gossip about the neighborhood furniture, especially the recliner 2 houses down that had been caught napping on the job. What was strange was the feeling in the air, a faint hum that buzzed against my skin like a secret trying to tell itself. When I swung my legs over the side, the floor wasn't there. Instead, I found myself standing on a soft, swirling mist that rose and fell like waves. Every step I took sent ripples of color across its surface, and somewhere deep below, something sparkled. "What's happening?" I asked, mostly to myself. The lamp on my nightstand blinked its light 3 times. Our usual code for no clue. "But you might want to check outside," it added, flickering toward the window. When I opened the curtains, the street wasn't a street anymore. It was a river. The houses floated gently on lily pads the size of parking spaces, their chimneys puffing out bubbles instead of smoke. Across the river, the horizon tilted at an odd angle, as though someone had knocked the world off its axis and forgotten to straighten it. A flock of birds shaped like question marks swooped overhead, and I could have sworn one of them winked at me. "Come on, sleepyhead," said the mist beneath my feet. "You don't want to miss it." "Miss what?" I asked, but the mist only giggled, curling around my ankles like an excited puppy. By the time I stepped outside, my house had grown a porch swing that wasn't there yesterday. It rocked gently, creaking a song I didn't recognize but somehow knew the words to. I hopped onto a lily pad, which wobbled under my weight but held steady. "Destination?" asked a voice, and I turned to see a fish in a pinstripe suit leaning out of the river, its fins folded like hands. I don't know," I stammered. The fish tipped its head, considering this. "That's a fine answer," it said, and with a flick of its tail, the lily pad started moving downstream. The river wasn't water exactly. It was too thick, too luminous, as though it had been spun from liquid moonlight. Beneath the surface, I saw shapes darting in and out of view. Glowing foxes with tails like comets, schools of miniature whales that leapt in unison, a piano drifting aimlessly while its keys played themselves. As we floated, the fish kept up a steady stream of chatter. "Busy day today," it said. "The stars are rehearsing for their annual parade. The trees are auditioning for the wind, and I hear the mountains might start dancing, though they're notoriously shy." "That sounds incredible," I said. "Oh, it is," the fish replied, giving me a sly grin. "But you've got your own appointment to keep." Before I could ask what it meant, we rounded a bend, and the river opened into a clearing. At the center was a massive clock, its hands spinning in opposite directions. Each tick sent a ripple through the air, distorting the world for a fraction of a second before it snapped back into place. Standing next to the clock was a woman dressed entirely in flowing shadows. Her face was hidden, but when she turned toward me, I felt like she was seeing every moment of my life all at once. "You're late," she said, though her voice wasn't accusatory. It was layered, as if a dozen versions of her were speaking at the same time. "For what?" I asked, stepping off the lily pad and onto the solid ground that wasn't solid at all. It shifted beneath my feet like the surface of a dream. "For this, of course," she said, gesturing to the clock. "The reset." "Reset of what?" She tilted her head, and for a moment, the shadows parted just enough to reveal a smile. "Everything." I didn't know how to respond to that, but she didn't seem to mind. She stepped closer, and as she did, the air around her shimmered, forming scenes like holograms. A child climbing a tree, a city covered in fog, a comet streaking across a desert sky. "It's not often we let someone choose," she said, holding out her hand. In her palm was a tiny, glowing thread. "But you seem interesting." "What am I choosing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled again, wider this time. "The next shape of things." I reached for the thread, and the moment I touched it, the world folded in on itself. Not violently, but like a piece of origami being carefully undone. Colors bled into sounds, sounds became shapes, and shapes melted into nothingness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my bed. The ceiling was solid, the floor was wood, and the clock on my nightstand was ticking quietly, its face blank and ordinary. For a moment, I wondered if I'd dreamed the whole thing. But then I noticed a single glowing thread on my nightstand, coiled neatly like a tiny golden promise. So here's the question I can't stop thinking about. If you were handed the thread of reality and told you could weave it into anything, what shape would you choose? Would you make it stranger? Soft? Let's start a new story. The first hint something was off came during the spring carnival. A rickety affair with cheap rides, half-broken carnival games, and more dust than cotton candy. It had been held every year since the 1980s, and by senior year, its charm had worn thin. But this time it was different. This time, there was the vault. The vault was a sudden addition, a battered steel door bolted into the side of the gym building. It looked like it had been there forever, even though nobody remembered seeing it before. Above it hung a hand-painted sign, "Win the key." Nobody knew what was inside or how the carnival organizers had managed to install it seemingly overnight, but it was all anyone could talk about. To win the key, you had to beat a series of games designed to test courage, wits, and teamwork, according to the cryptic announcement made during morning assembly. Principal Alderman, a perpetually bored man who'd rather golf than administrate, had seemed oddly energized as he explained it. "Something special awaits inside," he'd said almost gleefully, "but only for those who earn it." Most dismissed it as a gimmick, probably some lame motivational stunt about friendship or school pride. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if it wasn't? What if the vault really held something amazing? I wasn't the only one. By Friday afternoon, our group, me, Danny, Leo, and Krista, had decided to go for it. Not just for the prize, but for the thrill. The first challenge was simple, an escape room set up in the science wing. We had to solve a series of clues to unlock a door. It was fun in a low-stakes way, though Leo accidentally knocked over a skeleton model, which we all agreed was a bad omen. The clues led us to a janitor's closet, where we found a map tucked inside an old mop bucket. It was hand-drawn, detailing the carnival grounds, with a red X marking the next challenge. We followed the map to the old library, where the second game waited, a trivia contest against the gatekeeper. The gatekeeper turned out to be Mr. Ellis, the debate coach, wearing a medieval cloak and grinning like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. He bombarded us with absurdly specific questions about obscure topics. What year the school's cafeteria opened, the mascot's original name, the color of the first homecoming banner. Krista carried us here, somehow knowing that Bramble was briefly called Patches the Panda in 1974. When we answered the final question, Mr. Ellis handed us a plastic medallion and sent us to our final test. The field. The field wasn't a literal field, but the abandoned soccer pitch behind the school. Overgrown with weeds and surrounded by crumbling bleachers, it had been unused for years. A single spotlight illuminated a table in the center, and on it sat a red button under a glass dome. A man in a black suit stood beside it, his face hidden by a featureless white mask. "Only one may press the button," he said in a monotone voice. "But beware, pressing it may have consequences." What kind of consequences?" Leo asked, laughing nervously. The masked man didn't answer. This was obviously the kind of cheesy theatrics you'd expect from a carnival game. But standing there, with the wind howling through the empty bleachers, it didn't feel fake. The air was charged with something electric, like the ground was holding its breath. We hesitated, each of us waiting for someone else to step up. "I'll do it," Danny finally said. She was always the boldest of us, the one who'd cliff jump without checking the depth first. She reached out and pressed the button. The spotlight cut out. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, faintly, we heard a sound like distant metal grinding against metal. When the lights flickered back on, the man and the button were gone. In their place was a small bronze key. Leo picked it up, inspecting it like it might bite. "This is it, right? The key to the vault." "Let's find out," Danny said, already heading back toward the carnival. By the time we reached the vault, the crowd had thinned, and nobody seemed to notice us approach the steel door. Danny fit the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a pitch-black staircase descending into the earth. "Nope," Leo said immediately, but Krista grabbed his arm. "We came this far." We hesitated, then followed Danny into the dark. The air was cold and damp, each step echoing as we descended. At the bottom was a cavernous room, lit by a faint blue glow. Rows of shelves stretched endlessly, each one filled with strange objects. Antique radios, glowing jars, mechanical birds, and what looked like a typewriter that typed by itself. It was like a museum curated by a mad scientist. "What is this place?" Krista whispered, awestruck. In the center of the room was a pedestal. On it sat a small wooden box, unassuming but somehow magnetic. Danny opened it, revealing a single envelope. She unfolded the letter inside and read aloud. "Congratulations. You've found the vault. What lies within is for the brave, the curious, and the bold. You may take one item, but choose wisely, for every gift has a price." We looked at each other, unsure what to make of it. "A price," Leo said. "Like, what kind of price?" Nobody answered, but Danny was already moving toward the shelves. She picked up a snow globe that shimmered with a storm trapped inside. Krista gravitated toward a pocket watch that ticked backward. Leo grabbed a pair of sunglasses that, when he put them on, made him laugh uncontrollably. I hesitated, then reached for a pen with liquid silver ink swirling inside. When we left, the vault sealed behind us. Principal Alderman was waiting outside, smiling like he'd been expecting us. He didn't ask what we found, and we didn't tell him. But over the weeks that followed, strange things started happening. Danny's snow globe would glow at night, and Krista swore her watch gave her déjà vu. Leo said the sunglasses let him see things no one else could. And the pen I'd taken? It never seemed to run out of ink, and the stories I wrote with it. Well, let's just say they didn't stay on the page. Whatever the vault was, it had changed us. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still hear that grinding metal sound. Let's start a new story. It began with a toaster. A broken, stubborn toaster that refused to release my bagel. I'd been waging a low-grade battle with it for months, convinced I could fix it rather than admit defeat and buy a new one. That morning, my patience finally snapped. I unplugged the thing, shoved it into a canvas tote, and muttered to myself, "You're going to the repair shop, and I don't care if it costs more than buying a new one." The repair shop wasn't even close. I had to walk through a part of the city I barely knew. Streets that didn't feel unfriendly so much as indifferent, filled with graffiti-smeared walls and tiny shops squeezed between looming apartment blocks. It was the kind of place where you couldn't tell what a shop sold until you walked inside. The repair shop, when I found it, looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1970s. A cracked sign above the door read Edgar's Fix-It-All, and the window display was a chaotic jumble of radios, lamps, clocks, and things I couldn't identify. I stepped inside, the bell above the door jangling sharply, and was greeted by a faint smell of oil and dust. Edgar himself was nowhere to be seen. So I wandered deeper into the shop, past rows of old TVs stacked like a technological graveyard. As I approached the counter, a voice called out from the back, "You break it, you buy it." Before I could respond, a sudden rumble filled the air, a deep, groaning sound that vibrated through the floor. The lights flickered, and then, as quickly as it started, the noise stopped. The shop fell silent except for the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights. "What was that?" I called out. Edgar appeared from behind a curtain, wiping his hands on a rag. He was an older man, thin and wiry, with the kind of eyes that seemed to see right through you. He ignored my question and gestured at the toad in my hand. "What are you here for?" I held up the toaster like a peace offering. "It's possessed or something. Keeps eating my breakfast." He squinted at it, then grunted. "Leave it here. Pick it up next week." "Next week?" I protested. "Isn't this the kind of thing you could fix in like 20 minutes? He gave me a look that was equal parts pity and annoyance. "Do I look like I do rush jobs?" Before I could answer, he added, "You're not in a rush anyway." "What does that mean?" Instead of answering, he turned and disappeared through the curtain again. I stood there, baffled, and then, against all common sense, decided to follow him. The back room was unlike anything I expected. It was vast, far too large to fit within the building I'd entered, and filled with machines that defied logic. Spinning gears hovered in midair, glowing panels pulsed with colors I couldn't name, and strange, rhythmic sounds filled the space like a living heartbeat. "What is this place?" I whispered, but Edgar didn't seem surprised to see me. He was standing by a large console, adjusting a series of dials. "You wanted your toaster fixed," he said without looking up. "This is part of it." I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile or admit it was all some elaborate joke. Instead, he flipped a switch, and a section of the floor began to lower like an elevator platform. "You coming?" he asked, stepping onto it. I hesitated, every rational part of me screaming to turn back. But curiosity won out. I stepped onto the platform, and we descended into a cavernous space that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. The air here was warm, humming with the kind of energy I could feel in my chest. Machines of every shape and size were scattered throughout, some whirring quietly, others sparking like fireflies. "What is all this?" I finally managed to ask. "Everything," Edgar said simply. "Or at least everything people throw away. Every broken toaster, every busted radio, every gadget someone gives up on. It ends up here." I looked around, trying to wrap my head around the scale of it. "You fix all of this?" "Not everything," he admitted. "Some things can't be fixed, but most just need a little attention." I wandered over to a machine that looked like it had been cobbled together from old bicycle parts and typewriters. As I reached out to touch it, Edgar called out, "Careful. Some of these machines don't like being poked." "Machines don't have feelings," I said automatically, though I wasn't so sure anymore. "Not feelings," Edgar said. "Intentions. There's a difference." Before I could ask what he meant, a low, rhythmic clicking sound echoed through the space. Edgar's face lit up. "Ah, there it is." "There what is?" He pointed to a shadowy corner, where a tall, angular machine was glowing faintly. "Your toaster's soul." "My toaster has a soul?" "Of course it does. Everything does. Yours got stuck, that's all. Happens more often than you'd think." I wanted to argue, to laugh, to tell him he was insane, but there was something about the way he spoke, calm and matter-of-fact, that made it impossible to disbelieve him. He approached the glowing machine, placed his hand on it, and murmured something under his breath. A soft light flared, and the machine let out a sound like a sigh. "There," he said, turning back to me. "It's free now. Your toaster will work fine." I opened my mouth, then closed it again. There were too many questions, and I didn't even know where to start. Edgar seemed to sense this. "Don't overthink it," he said. "You came here because you wanted something fixed. That's all that matters." The platform carried us back up, and by the time we returned to the shop, everything looked as ordinary as it had when I walked in. Edgar handed me the toaster, now gleaming as if it were brand new. "No charge," he said with a faint smile. "But don't let it break again." I left the shop in a daze, clutching the toaster like it was some kind of sacred artifact. For days, I debated whether I'd imagine the whole thing, but the toaster worked perfectly, almost too perfectly, as if it were grateful to have been saved. Sometimes I think about going back to that shop just to see if it's still there, but part of me is afraid it won't be, that it was a one-time portal into a world I wasn't supposed to see. Either way, I'll never look at a broken machine the same way again. Have you ever stumbled into something that made you question everything you thought you knew about the world? Let's start a new story. The first postcard arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was tucked neatly between an electricity bill and a glossy flyer for a pizza place that had clearly never been to my neighborhood. The postcard was plain, its edges slightly worn, with a photograph of a lighthouse on the front. No location, no description, just the lighthouse against a stormy, gray sky. The back was blank except for 2 words written in blocky, uneven handwriting. "Come home." I stared at it, the words refusing to make sense. There was no return address, no name, just those 2 words, like a whisper from a voice I didn't recognize. I put it on the counter and told myself it was probably a mistake. Someone had mailed it to the wrong person. These things happened. But then the second postcard came. This one showed a dense forest, its trees gnarled and towering, their branches twisted into strange shapes. The same message was scrawled on the back, in the same heavy, deliberate letters. Come home. I hadn't thought about home in years. Not really. Home was a place I'd left behind when I was 19, a town so small it felt like it existed just to trap people in its borders. I hadn't been back since. There was nothing for me there. Or so I thought. The postcards kept coming, one every 3 or 4 days. A narrow, winding road flanked by snowdrifts. A lone crow perched on a telephone wire. A beach at sunset, the water glowing like molten gold. Each card carried the same message, and with every one, the feeling that they were meant for me grew harder to ignore. By the time the 7th postcard arrived, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table that night, all the postcards laid out in front of me, trying to piece them together like a puzzle. I noticed patterns where there weren't any, lines in the photographs that seemed to connect, shadows that felt too deliberate. The message was clear, even if I didn't want to believe it. I had to go back. The next morning, I packed a bag and got in the car. The drive to my hometown was longer than I remembered, the roads unfamiliar in a way that made my chest tighten. It was like the landscape had shifted in my absence, the trees leaning closer, the sky hanging lower. I reached the outskirts by late afternoon, the sun dipping behind the hills in a blaze of amber light. The town was exactly the same and completely different. The gas station still stood at the corner of Main Street, its sign missing the S, so it read J. Tatayon. The diner where I used to sneak milkshakes after curfew was now a boarded-up shell, its windows covered in faded posters for bands no one listened to anymore. And yet the streets felt wrong. Too quiet, too empty. I parked in front of the house I grew up in, the gravel driveway crunching beneath my tires. The house looked smaller than I remembered, its paint peeling, the porch sagging slightly at the edges. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of dust and wood polish. The living room was untouched, like a photograph frozen in time. The old armchair by the window, the coffee table with its chipped corner, the ceramic lamp that never worked but no one ever threw away. But something was missing. The postcards. I'd left them in my bag, zipped safely into the side pocket. But now, as I dug through my things, they were gone. The kitchen drawer where my mother used to keep the spare keys was ajar, and inside was a stack of photographs. They weren't mine, but they were familiar. The lighthouse, the forest, the crow on the wire. Each photograph was worn, the edges soft, as if they'd been handled too many times. Who sent these? I whispered, my voice trembling in the stillness. The answer came not from the room, but from the floor above. A soft creak of footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whoever, or whatever, was upstairs could hear it. Slowly, I made my way to the staircase, every step heavy with hesitation. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, the single bulb in the ceiling flickering weakly. At the end of the hall was my old bedroom, its door ajar, a faint light spilling out from inside. "Hello?" I called, my voice breaking. No answer. I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but it wasn't mine anymore. The bed was gone, replaced by a small wooden table in the center of the room. On the table was a single photograph, its edges singed as if it had been pulled from a fire. The photograph was of me, not me as I was now, but me as I had been the day I left this town. I was standing in front of the house, my suitcase in one hand, a determined, defiant look on my face. Beneath the photograph, written in the same blocky handwriting as the postcards, was a single question. "Why did you leave?" I stumbled back, my head spinning. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, as if the walls were pressing closer. I turned and ran down the stairs, through the living room, and out the front door, my breath ragged and my heart threatening to burst. The car wouldn't start. The sun was gone now, and the town was shrouded in shadows. I could see lights in the distance, houses, street lamps, but they flickered weakly, as if they weren't quite real. The road stretched ahead of me, impossibly long, and as I started to run, I felt it, something behind me, watching, waiting. The last postcard arrived 2 weeks later. It was blank. Let's start a new story. The first thing you should know is that I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd left my apartment to return a library book before the overdue fees got embarrassing, but the rain had other plans. It wasn't just rain, it was biblical. A sudden wall of water that turned the street into a river and left me stranded under the awning of a boarded-up shop. It didn't even have a sign, just peeling paint and a window covered in yellowed newspaper clippings. I glanced at the headlines out of boredom, trying to ignore the way the cold had sunk into my bones. Mysterious treasure found in city sewer. Vanishing tea shop returns after 20 years. Doors where they shouldn't be. The last one caught my eye, mostly because it felt like it was talking to me. I had half a mind to take a picture when I noticed something strange. The door to the shop was cracked open. I couldn't remember seeing anyone go in, but there it was, a sliver of warm, golden light spilling out onto the wet sidewalk. Before I could stop myself, I pushed the door open the rest of the way. The smell hit me first, warm cedar and cinnamon, like stepping into someone's cozy winter cabin. Then the sound, faint music, like an old record playing in another room. The inside was nothing like the outside. Where I'd expected dusty shelves or empty floors, I found everything. Bookshelves that stretched impossibly high. Glass cases filled with objects I couldn't begin to name. Shimmering stones, strange masks, mechanical birds. There were jars of dried herbs, stacks of maps with faded ink, and, oddly enough, a spinning wheel in the corner, its needle glinting faintly in the light. And at the center of it all, behind a wide mahogany desk, sat the shopkeeper. "Welcome," they said, smiling like I was exactly the person they'd been waiting for. They weren't old or young. They had one of those faces that could belong to anyone, and their clothes were strange. A patchwork coat that seemed to shift patterns when I looked away. They gestured for me to come closer, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I did. "Lost or curious?" they asked, tilting their head. I said eloquently, "Neither. I was just trying to get out of the rain." "Ah," they said, as if that explained everything. Rain does tend to push people where they need to be. I glanced around the shop, my curiosity outweighing my confusion. "What is this place?" "A store," they said, as if it were obvious. "But not for money." "Okay," I said slowly. "What's for sale then?" They leaned forward, resting their elbows on the desk. "Not for sale. For trade. Something you've carried too long for something you didn't know you needed." I laughed nervously. "Like what? A haunted lamp?" They didn't laugh. Instead, they reached under the desk and pulled out a small black box. It was simple, unadorned, but something about it made my chest tighten. "This," they said, "is a moment." "A moment," I repeated because I was apparently incapable of original thought. They nodded. "A moment you'll need later. When you open it, time will stretch. Long enough to make a choice you couldn't otherwise make." I stared at the box. It didn't look magical. It looked like something you'd use to store old cufflinks. "And what do I have to give for it?" The shopkeeper's gaze sharpened. "That depends. What are you ready to let go of?" I wanted to say, "This is insane," but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself thinking of all the things I'd been dragging around with me. Regrets, guilt, fear, the kind of stuff that keeps you awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what you could have done differently. "Is it permanent?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. They nodded solemnly. "It has to be." I swallowed hard. The rain outside was still pounding, but it felt distant now, like a memory of rain instead of the real thing. My hand drifted to my jacket pocket, where I always kept a small silver bracelet. It wasn't expensive or even particularly pretty, but it had been my mother's. She'd given it to me right before she died, and I'd worn it ever since. I hesitated, fingers brushing the cool metal. "What happens if I give this?" The shopkeeper tilted their head again. "Only you can answer that." It was a terrible answer, the kind of answer that makes you question your sanity. But somehow, I knew they weren't lying. I slipped the bracelet off and placed it on the desk. The shopkeeper's smile softened, almost sad. "You'll still remember her," they said gently, "but it won't feel like a weight anymore." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. They pushed the black box toward me, their fingers lingering on the edge. "When the time comes, you'll know." I picked it up, surprised by how heavy it felt. It was warm, almost alive, and for a second I thought I heard faint music coming from inside. Will I ever see this place again? I asked. They smiled, their patchwork coat shifting into a pattern of stars. Not unless you need to. When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was clear, the kind of deep, endless blue that makes you feel like you could fall into it. The box was still in my hand, its weight grounding me in a way I couldn't explain. I haven't opened it yet. I don't know what choice it's meant for, or when that moment will come. But I do know one thing. Whatever I left behind, it doesn't hurt the way it used to. Have you ever felt like the world offered you a deal? One so strange and perfect you couldn't say no? Let's start a new story. When I woke up this morning, my ceiling fan was spinning lazily, muttering to itself like a grizzled old detective. Another night of heavy breathing, it said. Why do I even bother? Nobody ever thanks the fan. They just flip a switch and forget I exist. I blinked, slowly registering the voice. You're talking, I said, still groggy. The fan slowed down slightly, as if to glare at me. Took you long enough to notice. I've been here every summer night, keeping you cool. But sure, only now I get some acknowledgement. Cool. I murmured. I'm losing my mind. Nah, the fan replied. You're just finally listening. I sat up, and the creak of the bed frame was almost deafening. Easy there, it grunted, its voice deep and gravelly, like it belonged to an overworked truck driver. Do you have to flop down on me like a sack of bricks every night? I've got screws older than your Netflix account. That got my attention. Are you saying I'm heavy? The bed frame let out a humorless chuckle. I'm saying you don't treat me with respect. You think I like this job? Holding your dead weight while you scroll through memes until 2 a.m. At that point, I decided I needed coffee. I shuffled to the kitchen, half expecting the floorboards to start complaining about my footsteps. They didn't, but the refrigerator greeted me with a low, ominous hum. You've got 5 seconds to close my door, it rumbled as I opened it. This isn't a staring contest. Take the milk and go. I yanked the milk carton out on reflex. It sighed in relief. Finally, freedom. I thought you'd leave me in there until I curdled. I put the milk on the counter, and the coffee machine perked up immediately. Coffee time, it chirped, its voice bubbly and excitable, like a hyperactive morning person. Let's brew. Let's percolate. Let's get you buzzed. While it worked its magic, the sugar bowl piped up, sounding weirdly defensive. Don't overdo it. You always blame me for your bad teeth, but I'm not the one who decided to eat 3 cookies last night. The mug sitting on the counter chimed in. You gonna wash me properly this time? Or are you just gonna rinse and pretend that counts? By the time my coffee was ready, I was too stunned to argue. I sipped it in silence, listening to the muffled voices of the kitchen appliances as they bickered with each other. The dishwasher accused the sink of being lazy, while the stove bragged about its culinary contributions. I learned more about their interpersonal drama in 10 minutes than I ever wanted to know. Hoping to escape the chaos, I stepped outside. Big mistake. The moment I opened the door, a gust of wind hit me, carrying a flurry of tiny whispers. I realized it was the grass. Great, it murmured, a collective voice rising from the blades. Here comes Big Feet again. Stomp, stomp, stomp. It's not like we're alive or anything. Sorry, I said instinctively. Oh, he apologizes, the grass replied, dripping with sarcasm. How thoughtful. Maybe next time, try walking on the sidewalk. I ignored the grass and headed down the street. A crow sitting on a power line cawed loudly. Hey, you dropped your phone last week, didn't you? I saw it happen. Hilarious. I froze. How do you know about that? The crow tilted its head. We're always watching. You humans are fascinating. So clumsy, yet so proud. Like baby deer trying to walk in high heels. The neighborhood cats were lounging in a driveway, engaged in what sounded like a heated debate. Tuna, one hissed. It's the superior treat. End of discussion. You're basic, another replied with a haughty flick of its tail. Salmon is for connoisseurs. At this point, I had to laugh. It was all so absurd. I waved at the cats, which earned me a collective glare. What are you looking at? One of them snapped. I kept walking and tried to enjoy the fresh air, but even the trees were chatty. A particularly large oak leaned toward me, its branches creaking. "Hey, you see that car over there? It's been parked under me for a week, and the guy hasn't cleaned up the leaves. Disrespectful." "Maybe he's busy," I offered weakly. The oak snorted. "Busy? With what? Scrolling TikTok? People these days have no sense of responsibility." When I finally made it back home, I collapsed onto the couch, hoping for a moment of peace. Instead, the couch let out a low groan. Another day, another flop. You ever think about fluffing my cushions? No, of course not. I rub my temples. I just need a break. The TV turned on by itself, the screen flickering to life. "Oh, you're back," it said. "Ready to binge watch another garbage show? Or maybe you'll scroll endlessly through the options and then give up." I considered arguing, but the remote chimed in. "Don't bother. You know they're right." Despite the constant commentary, I found myself smiling. It was strange, yes, but the world had never felt so alive. Everything had a voice, a personality, an opinion. Even if most of those opinions were about how poorly I treated my possessions, it was oddly comforting. Like living in a sitcom where the entire cast was made of sarcastic appliances and judgmental birds. So here's my question. If your world came to life like mine did, would you embrace it? Or would you hide in a closet and risk getting an earful from your hangers? Let's start a new story. The bus was late, as usual. I stood under the faded shelter, pulling my scarf tighter against the wind and watching as leaves skittered along the sidewalk like tiny, urgent messengers. It wasn't just cold, it was the kind of biting chill that settled into your bones and made you question every life choice that led to you standing outside instead of somewhere warm and coffee-filled. I glanced at the digital display on the bus stop sign. 15 more minutes. Fantastic. That's when I saw him. At first, he was just a blur of motion out of the corner of my eye. Someone running, fast and frantic, like he was being chased. But as he got closer, I realized there was no one behind him. He was just sprinting for no apparent reason, holding what looked like a plastic grocery bag flapping wildly in the wind. As he approached the bus stop, he skidded to a halt, breathing hard and looking like he'd just finished a marathon. I stared at him, and he stared back, both of us caught in that awkward limbo of two strangers sharing an absurd moment. Finally, he held up the bag and said, "I didn't want the ice cream to melt." I blinked. "What?" "The ice cream," he repeated, still gasping for air. He shook the bag for emphasis, and I caught a glimpse of a pint of something inside. I figured the bus would be faster than walking, but then I realized I was late, so... "You ran for your ice cream?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's not just any ice cream," he said, as if that explained everything. "It's mint chocolate chip, the best flavor. Non negociable." I crossed my arms, fighting the urge to smirk. Debatable. He looked genuinely horrified. "No, absolutely not. You could debate a lot of things. Pineapple on pizza, the Oxford comma, but mint chocolate chip is untouchable." I shrugged. "I'm more of a caramel swirl person." "Caramel swirl?" He said it like I'd confessed to eating gravel. "You're seriously going to stand here and tell me caramel swirl is better than mint chocolate chip?" Before I could respond, he plopped down onto the bench, still clutching the bag like it contained the cure for a rare disease. "You know what?" he said, his breath finally evening out. "I'm going to let that slide. Everyone's allowed one character flaw." I laughed before I could stop myself. "You don't even know me." He grinned up at me. "I know enough. You're standing at a bus stop in freezing weather. That takes guts. Or poor planning." "Definitely the latter," I admitted, sitting down beside him. The bench was freezing, but at least it was better than standing. "I'm Sam, by the way," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Isabel," I replied, shaking it. For a moment, we sat in silence, watching the occasional car rumble past. It wasn't the kind of quiet that begged to be filled, but Sam didn't seem like the kind of person who could sit still for long. "So, Isabel," he began, "tell me, what's the most exciting thing that's happened to you at a bus stop?" "Exciting?" I said, thinking back. "Once a guy tried to sell me a parrot." Sam's eyes widened. "No way." "Way," I said. "It was in a cage and everything. He kept saying it was a deal of a lifetime." "Did you buy it?" "No, I live in a studio apartment. Where would I put a parrot?" Fair point, he said, nodding sagely. But you missed out. A parrot would have made you the most interesting person on the block. I shrugged. I think I'll survive. Just then, the bus appeared at the end of the street, its headlights cutting through the gloom. Sam stood up, hoisting the bag and brushing non-existent dust off his jeans. Well, Isabel of the Caramel Swirl Persuasion, it's been a pleasure. You're getting off already? I asked, surprised. He shook his head. Nah, I live a couple of stops down. But I figured I'd say my goodbyes now, just in case you bolt the second the doors open. I rolled my eyes but smiled. Maybe I will. Can't let you convert me to mint chocolate chip. Hey, I respect your right to be wrong, he said, grinning. When the bus pulled up, we both climbed aboard, jostling for space in the crowded aisle. I found a seat near the back, and Sam ended up standing a few feet away, gripping a pole with one hand and his precious ice cream bag with the other. Every so often, he glanced back at me, like he was trying to decide whether to say something more. Finally, as the bus lurched toward his stop, he turned and called out, Hey, Isabel? Yeah, if I don't see you again, good luck finding that parrot. I laughed, shaking my head. Good luck keeping your ice cream from melting. He held up the bag triumphantly. Mint chocolate chip never melts. It perseveres. With that, he hopped off the bus, disappearing into the night like a ridiculous, ice cream-obsessed enigma. I sat there, staring at the now empty space where he'd been, and realized I was still smiling. It wasn't love at first sight or some grand cinematic moment, but it was something else, something unexpected and fleeting, like a favorite song playing on the radio when you least expect it. And as the bus rumbled toward my stop, I couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, Sam had been right. Some things like mint chocolate chip were worth running for. Let's start a new story. That was the first oddity. The second was that I was holding something, a long, wooden staff, smooth and warm, as if it had been shaped by human hands but weathered by centuries of use. Around me, the air shimmered faintly, and the sky above was neither blue nor gray, but a deep, endless gold, swirling slowly like molten metal. I wasn't alone. All around me, figures stood motionless, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They were arranged in perfect rows, each holding their own staff. Some looked like me, confused, wide-eyed, but others had a calm, purposeful air, as though this wasn't new to them. Their features were diverse. Humans, creatures with impossibly long limbs and faces carved from stone, beings that looked like walking shadows. None of it made sense. I wanted to speak, but the air felt heavy, pressing against my throat. Before I could try, a ripple passed through the crowd, a soundless wave of motion as everyone turned their heads in unison, staring at a single point in the distance. Slowly, I followed their gaze. There on the horizon was a massive gate, not like the gates of a city, but something alive. Its form shifted with every blink. A pair of enormous wings one moment, a swirl of liquid glass the next. It pulsed faintly, glowing with the same molten gold as the sky. And then the staff in my hand began to pull. Not hard, but insistently, like a gentle current tugging at my body. Around me, the other figures began moving toward the gate, their steps slow but deliberate. It was like being part of a tide. I tried to resist, planting my feet against the strange, glass-like ground, but the staff pulled harder, and my legs betrayed me, stepping forward on their own. As we drew closer, the gate shifted again, its surface resolving into something more solid. Words appeared on it, carved deep into its surface in a language I couldn't read, but somehow understood. Everything here lies on the other side. Everything you're not stays here. The words burned in my mind, as if etched into my thoughts. One by one, the figures ahead of me reached the gate. Each time it seemed to react differently. Some were consumed by light, their forms dissolving into golden sparks. Others stepped through and emerged on the other side, transformed, some visibly changed, others subtly so, but never the same. A few stopped just short, their staves splintering in their hands as they sank into the ground, swallowed without a sound. What happens if I don't go through? I thought, the question ringing loud in the silence of my mind. To my surprise, the staff answered, not in words, but in a rush of images. I saw myself staying behind, rooted in this strange, golden field, becoming one of the shadows, my edges fraying until I was barely more than a wisp in the wind. It wasn't painful or frightening. It was nothingness, pure and simple. When it was my turn, the gate loomed above me, taller than I'd thought possible. The words on its surface shifted, rearranging themselves into something new. Step forward and be seen. Step back and forget. I hesitated. What did it mean to be seen? And what was I supposed to leave behind? I turned to look at the others, but their faces were unreadable, their forms already vanishing into the gate or dissolving into the ground. The staff pulsed in my hand, a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. It felt alive, almost as if it were waiting. I raised it, unsure of what I was doing, and the golden light around me flickered. Do you know what's on the other side? A voice asked suddenly. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't the staff. It came from behind me. I turned to see a figure standing apart from the crowd. They were unlike anyone else here, dressed in patchwork fabric that shimmered like oil on water, their face obscured by a mask of cracked porcelain. Where their eyes should have been were two softly glowing orbs, faintly blue. No, I admitted. Do you? They tilted their head. I know what it was for me, but that doesn't mean it will be the same for you. What did you see? A mirror, they said simply. It showed me everything I could have been. Then it asked me to choose. And what did you choose? They chuckled softly. That's the thing. The gate isn't about choice. It's about whether you can carry what you see. Can you bear to keep walking once you know? My grip on the staff tightened. What happens if you can't? The figure shrugged. You stay, or you break. Either way, you're no longer you. They gestured toward the gate. Your turn. I turned back. The words on the gate had changed again. Step forward and no. Step back and never. This time I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward. The moment I passed through the gate, the world shattered. Not like glass, but like a reflection breaking apart. Each shard spinning outward, showing me pieces of myself. Memories, choices, and versions of me I'd never met. Some triumphant, others shattered, some barely recognizable. I saw paths I'd taken and paths I'd abandoned. Every step branching infinitely into something else. In the center of it all was me, or something close to me, a figure formed from light and shadow, constantly shifting, holding a staff identical to mine. It looked at me and spoke without words, its voice echoing in my mind. What will you leave behind? I didn't know what it meant. Leave behind what? You cannot take all of yourself forward. The weight is too great. What will you leave? I tried to answer, but my voice caught. Around me, the fragments of my life pulsed, waiting. Slowly, I reached out, touching one. It dissolved under my fingers, and with it, I felt something inside me unravel, a regret I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The figure nodded, and I understood. Piece by piece, I let go. Some shards were painful to touch, others sweet, but with each one, I felt lighter. When I stepped through to the other side, the golden world was gone. I was somewhere new, somewhere I couldn't quite describe. My staff was still in my hand, but it felt different now, heavier, yet easier to carry. Ahead of me stretched a road I couldn't see the end of, but for the first time in my life, I didn't need to. I was ready to walk it. If the gate appeared to you, would you step through? What would you leave behind? Let's start a new story. We were at this house party, one of those rambling, chaotic affairs where the music's too loud, and you're always either bumping into someone or apologizing for stepping on their shoes. I didn't know most of the people there, and neither did he, which was probably why we ended up tucked into a quieter corner, nursing drinks that had lost their chill hours ago. I barely knew him. He was a friend of a friend, someone I'd chatted with at exactly one other gathering. But he had this kind of energy, low-key but magnetic like gravity in a worn leather jacket. We were in the middle of debating the merits of pineapple on pizza when I heard it. The faint, tentative notes of a piano drifting through the chaos. Is that Liv? I asked, half turning toward the sound. His eyes lit up. There's a piano here, he said, like he'd just been handed the keys to a secret kingdom. Without waiting for an answer, he grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the music. The source was an upright piano tucked into a sunroom at the back of the house, where the walls were more windows than anything else. The guy playing it, a tall, gangly figure who might have been wearing pajamas, didn't even look up as we approached. He was absorbed in his own world, playing something soft and haunting that didn't quite match the mood of the party. "That's beautiful," I whispered. "It's sad," he said, tilting his head like he was listening to the notes in a way I couldn't. "But beautiful, yeah." Then, without warning, he turned to me and said, "Do you play?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Not since middle school, and even then, barely." "Perfect," he said, his grin widening. "Come on, let's make some noise." Before I could protest, he slipped onto the bench beside the pianist, murmured something I didn't catch, and then scooted over to make room for me. I sat reluctantly, my hands hovering awkwardly over the keys as he started tapping out a slow, simple melody. "Just follow me," he said, his voice low and easy. I tried. I missed notes, stumbled over rhythms, and hit more wrong keys than right ones, but he didn't seem to care. Every time I faltered, he'd throw in something playful, a sudden flourish, a jazzy riff that made me laugh in spite of myself. At some point, the original pianist wandered off, leaving the bench to just the two of us. Outside, the rain started to fall, soft and steady, the droplets sliding down the glass like tiny rivers. The noise of the party faded into the background, replaced by the strange, unpolished music we were making. And then he shifted gears. "Okay," he said, stopping abruptly. "I'm going to play something. You have to close your eyes." "What? Why?" "Just trust me," he said, his smile turning serious for the first time that night. "Close your eyes." I hesitated, but then the quiet challenge in his gaze melted me. I closed them. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like the beginning of a story that wasn't sure where it wanted to go. But then it grew, a melody that felt warm and familiar, like something I should have recognized but didn't. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, his voice low. "No," I admitted, keeping my eyes shut. "It's you," he said simply. My breath caught. "What do you mean?" "It's what you sound like in my head," he said, his fingers still moving across the keys. Curious, kind of chaotic, a little stubborn, but sweet too, and funny, and brave. I opened my eyes then, even though I knew I wasn't supposed to. He didn't notice. He was too caught up in the music, his face soft and unguarded in a way I'd never seen before. And just like that, I realized I was seeing him the same way he was hearing me, clearly for the first time. When he finished, the last notes hanging in the air like smoke, I didn't know what to say. The party noise had crept back in, but it felt distant, like it belonged to another world. I trailed off, shaking my head. "I don't have words." "Good," he said with a grin, turning to face me. "Words ruin it anyway." We left the party not long after that, wandering through the rain-slick streets without any real destination. The city was quiet, except for the occasional splash of water beneath our feet and the faint hum of traffic in the distance. And the whole time, I kept hearing his music in my head, as if he'd left a part of it with me. Or maybe a part of himself. We've been together ever since, but that night stands apart in my memory, glowing like an ember I keep tucked in my pocket for cold days. He still plays the piano sometimes, though he says he's never been able to recreate the song he played for me that night. Good. I always tell him, some things aren't meant to be repeated. Have you ever had a moment on a date that felt like stepping into someone else's dream?